Gideon Varick didn't lower his voice when he said it. That was the part nobody forgot. He stood at the front counter of the Northwind House Inn, coat still dry despite the blizzard tearing apart the world outside. And he looked at the man behind him, a hollowed-out cowboy, holding two shivering children by the hand, and said, loud enough for every soul in that warm room to hear, "Elowen, you let that kind through your door, you'll be counting your silverware in the morning." The little girl flinched. The boy pressed his face into his father's leg. And the father, Silas Mercer, said nothing. Just stood there with storm ice still melting off his hat brim, staring at the floor like a man who'd already been broken so many times he didn't have the energy to bleed anymore. What Varick didn't know, what none of them knew that night, was that the penniless man he just humiliated was about to save the very land sitting beneath their feet. If you've ever been looked at like you were nothing, like the worst day of your life was entertainment for someone who's never had a bad one, then you already know exactly how Silas Mercer felt standing in that doorway. Stay with me. This one's going to matter to you. Before we go further, if stories like this are the reason you come back to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see just how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next, nobody in Red Willow Crossing saw coming. The storm had been chasing them for 2 days. Silas knew weather. He'd spent the better part of 23 years reading Montana skies the way some men read the Bible carefully, with genuine fear of what he might find. And the sky that had rolled in from the northwest 2 mornings ago wasn't a storm you rode through. It was the kind that decided things. It settled disputes. It chose who stayed and who didn't make it. He had the children on one horse, his oldest, a roan named Tuesday, that he'd traded half a winter's wages for 8 years back. Tuesday was tired, Silas was worse. Lydia, his 10-year-old, sat behind Cal with her arms wrapped up around her little brother's middle, and she hadn't complained once in 40 miles, which was the thing about Lydia that both made him proud and broke something in his chest whenever he thought about it too long. She was too young to be that quietly brave. Cal had stopped talking somewhere around noon. That scared Silas more than the cold. 6-year-olds didn't stop talking. Not unless something was wrong. Cal. He kept his voice even. The kind of voice you used when you needed a scared animal to trust you. "Talk to me, bud. My feet don't feel like feet anymore." Cal said it matter-of-factly, the way children deliver terrible news. They feel like wood. Silas made a decision right then. Red Willow Crossing was another 4 miles. Could have been 40, the way the snow was moving sideways. But 4 miles was 4 miles, and you rode it or you didn't. "Hold Tuesday's mane," he said, both hands. "Don't let go." He got off and walked. The wind was the kind that found the gaps in everything between collar and neck, between boot leather and sock, between what you thought you could endure and what you actually could. He led Tuesday by the bridle with one hand and kept the other on Cal's ankle, just to feel the warmth of the boy through his boot leather, just to know it was still there. He didn't let himself think about the ranch. He'd spent 3 weeks trying not to think about it, and failing every time darkness came. The drought had started 2 years past, and the creditors had started 8 months after that. And by September, there wasn't enough left to argue about. The bank took the cattle, then the equipment, then the land itself, 80 acres, his father had broken from nothing, that his grandfather before him had first squinted at and called home. Gone in a bankruptcy proceeding that lasted 40 minutes and involved 2 lawyers he couldn't afford, and 1 judge who kept checking his pocket watch. He'd loaded what he could into a saddlebag, left the rest. He didn't know where he was going when he left. He still didn't entirely. But he knew he needed a wall between his children and that wind, and he needed it before Cal's wooden feet became something a doctor would need to discuss. Red Willow Crossing appeared out of the white, like something from a fever dream lantern light bleeding through shuttered windows, smoke from chimneys bending sideways in the gale. Silas had been so relieved to see a town in his life, and he'd once ridden into Billings with an arrow in his shoulder. So that was saying something. The Northwind House Inn was the largest building on the main road. He'd heard of it vaguely, a reputation that traveled the territory for clean rooms and decent food. He hadn't heard the prices, which, he was about to discover, was the kind of information that mattered. He tied Tuesday to the post outside, lifted Cal down, and held the boy against his chest. For a moment, the child's cold face against his neck, and took both children by the hand and pushed through the front door. The warmth hit him like a wall. He almost staggered. The room was full of people, ranchers, and merchants in from the storm, a couple of ranch wives at a corner table, 2 men playing cards near the window, a fire in the stone hearth big enough to heat a barn, the smell of roasting meat and coffee and wood smoke, everything warm, everything dry, and there at the front counter was Gideon Varick. Silas recognized the type before he knew the name. Expensive coat, expensive boots, the particular carriage of a man who'd never once in his life worried about his feet going wooden in a storm. Varick was talking to the woman behind the counter, Elowen Hartwell, though Silas didn't know her name yet, with the ease of someone accustomed to having the room's attention whenever he wanted it. He turned when the door opened, took in Silas, took in the children, and his face did something that Silas had seen on certain kinds of men before, a very slight tightening around the eyes, a recalibration, the moment when they decided you were not a person to be dealt with, but a problem to be managed. Elowen. Varick didn't move, didn't lower his voice, addressed her like Silas was furniture. You let that kind through your door, you'll be counting your silverware in the morning. The room went quiet. Not all at once, but a spreading wave. First the people closest to Varick, then the card players, then finally the women in the corner, until the only sound was the fire and the storm pressing against the windows. Lydia's hand tightened in Silas's. She didn't say anything. She was 10 years old, and she already understood that some silences were more dangerous than the ones that came before them. Silas looked at the floor. He'd learned somewhere in the last year of losing everything that looking at the floor was the safest option when men like Varick performed for an audience. Meeting their eyes gave them something to escalate against. The floor gave them nothing. But he heard her voice, and it wasn't what he expected. Mr. Varick. Elowen Hartwell's voice was level, not sharp, not flustered level, the way a woman speaks when she's decided something and doesn't need anyone's permission for the decision. I believe you were headed for the dining room. I'm just pointing out. The dining room, she said again. Same tone, same volume. Immovable. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds, which was long enough for the entire room to understand that she'd won it without raising her voice. Varick made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite acknowledgement, and then he turned and walked toward the dining room arch, and 2 men who'd been hovering near him followed without being asked. The room exhaled. Elowen Hartwell came around the counter. She was somewhere in her early 40s. Silas guessed dark hair threaded with gray that she hadn't bothered to hide, a face that had seen weather and worry and hadn't been undone by either. She looked at Cal first, then at Lydia, then at Silas. Your boy's feet, she said. Get his boots off the moment you're in the room. Get them both in front of something warm. I appreciate that, ma'am. What I need is to know your rate for the night, because I don't have... He stopped, made himself say it plainly, because there was nothing to be gained from circling it. I have 43 cents and some dried venison. That's what I have. He'd said the same sentence, or some version of it, 5 times in the last 2 weeks. Every single time, it had ended the same way. Sometimes politely, sometimes not. Always the same result. Elowen Hartwell looked at him for a moment. Not the way Varick had looked at him, not the measurement of a problem. She looked at him the way a person looks at another person when they're actually seeing them. Come with me, she said. She led them down a hall, past 2 closed doors, and opened a third. Inside was the finest room Silas had seen in years, a real bed, with an iron frame, a second narrow bed for the children, a wash basin and pitcher, a small iron stove already radiating heat. The window had thick curtains pulled against the storm. This is your family room, she said. It's yours for the night. He started to speak, and she talked over him, not rudely, just efficiently. Get that boy's boots off. There's extra blankets in the chest. She pointed at a cedar chest at the foot of the large bed. Dinner's served until 8. Your children are welcome at the table. She paused at the door. There are towels on the rack, ma'am. He stopped her. I told you what I have. You told me, she agreed. Leave your 43 cents in your pocket. Your children eat tonight and sleep warm tonight. We'll talk in the morning if there's anything to discuss. She left before he could find an argument. Silas stood in the middle of that warm room for a long moment. Cal had already discovered the cedar chest and was dragging out a blanket nearly the size of himself. Lydia was looking at the bed with the expression of someone trying not to want something too much in case it got taken away. He sat down on the edge of the bed and started unlacing Cal's boots with hands that weren't entirely steady. Cal's feet were cold, but not frostbitten. The color came back within minutes of getting them next to the stove, which meant Tuesday had been moving fast enough, and Silas had been walking long enough that they'd made the right call at the right time. He sat off the floor next to the stove and watched the color return to his son's toes, and didn't let himself think about how close the margin had been. "Papa," Cal said, in that direct way of his that cut through everything. "Is she nice?" "I think so." "That other man wasn't nice." "No, he wasn't. Why does he get to talk like that?" Silas thought about several answers. He settled on the truth, trimmed down to a size a 6-year-old could carry. Some men think money gives them the right to say things. It doesn't, but it sometimes gives them the room to do it without consequences. Cal thought about this with the gravity of a child who takes everything literally. That doesn't seem fair. It isn't. Lydia had gone quiet by the window. She was watching the storm through the gap in the curtain, and Silas recognized the posture she was doing, the thing she did when something was bothering her that she hadn't figured out how to say yet. She'd gotten that from him, which he wasn't sure was a good inheritance. Lied. "I'm fine, I know you're fine, you're always as fine. Talk anyway." She let the curtain fall. Turned. She had her mother's eyes clear and direct, and entirely unwilling to let you pretend something was simpler than it was. Margaret had been gone 4 years now, taken by fever in the spring before the drought, and some days Silas could barely look at Lydia without the grief rising up fresh and unexpected. A bruise you kept forgetting was there until you pressed it. "Are we going to have to leave tomorrow?" Lydia asked. "I don't know." She was kind. "I don't want to have to leave somewhere kind." He didn't have an answer for that. He wanted to give her certainty, the way children deserved certainty, but he'd run out of it so long ago, he couldn't remember what it felt like to have it. "Let's eat dinner," he said instead, "and sleep somewhere warm. And in the morning, we'll figure out the next thing." It wasn't enough. He could see it wasn't enough, but it was all he had. Dinner was simple stew with actual beef in it, bread that was fresh that morning, milk for the children, and coffee for Silas that he wrapped both hands around like it was a lifeline. The dining room was less full by the time they came down. Varick conspicuously absent, which meant the room was warmer, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. A young woman who worked for Elowen brought their food and didn't treat them differently from the men at the adjacent table, who'd clearly paid the full rate. That small thing, he noticed it. Elowen herself came through the dining room once, checking on things, and paused at their table for a moment. "How are the feet?" she asked Cal. Cal looked up from his stew. "Back to feet," he said seriously. She smiled, a real one, not a performed one. "Good." She moved on. Silas watched her work the room a word here, a small correction there, the particular competence of someone who'd run their operation alone long enough that they didn't need to announce themselves to be in charge. He noticed the way a couple of the older ranch hands near the window tracked her with something between respect and concern, the way people look at someone they're quietly worried about. He noticed the ledger she'd been reviewing at the counter when they first arrived, and the pen she'd set down quickly when they walked in, the gesture of someone interrupted in the middle of difficult numbers. He noticed the dining room that was probably designed to hold 20, but tonight held 8. He noticed things. It was a habit he'd never been able to break, even when noticing things only told him news he didn't want to hear. He put his children to bed that night in the big room, Cal already nearly asleep before his head touched the pillow, Lydia reading by the stove light with the focused attention she gave everything: books, people, problems. He sat in the chair by the window for a long time after, listening to the storm work itself out overhead. Before first light, he was up. He didn't have a plan exactly. What he had was the bone-deep inability to accept warmth without earning it, something his father had drilled into him so early and so thoroughly it had become less a principle than a physical reflex. He found his coat, found his boots, found his way to the barn without waking the children. The barn held 8 horses. 3 of them were guests' animals, including Tuesday in the 4th stall, and 5 belonged to the inn. Most of its windows were dark. The inn's animals hadn't been properly checked since before the storm hit. He could tell by the water troughs and the state of the bedding. Nothing urgent, nothing cruel, just the natural result of one bad storm taking priority over stable routines. He worked quietly, checked hooves, refreshed water, spread clean bedding, redistributed hay. He talked to the horses the way he always talked to horses, not quite words, not quite nonsense, something in between that seemed to matter to them even when the content didn't. Tuesday pressed her nose against his arm when he passed, and he stopped forehead against hers for a moment. "We'll figure it out," he told her. He'd been saying that a lot lately. He found the snow shovels in the lean-to attached to the barn, and he shoveled a path from the barn to the back door of the inn, and then a second path around the side to the front. The snow was heavy, the kind that packed and set like something between ice and concrete, and he wasn't warm enough for the work, but he did it anyway, because the alternative was going back inside and sitting with his thoughts, and his thoughts had not been good company lately. By the time Elowen came out at 6 in the morning, the paths were clear, the front steps were salted, and Silas was working on a section of fence along the east side of the property where 2 posts had been pushed over by a tree branch dropped under the storm's weight. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He saw her see what he'd done. He kept working. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "No, ma'am." "You didn't have to, I know." She was quiet for a beat. "Fence wires in the barn. Left side, middle shelf." "Found it already," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she went back inside without another word. He kept working. He didn't know yet what the next day would bring, or the day after. He didn't know about Varick's plans, or the western pasture, or the forgotten channel buried under decades of silt. He didn't know that the thing he'd done by walking through that door, by existing in this place, in front of these people, at this moment had already started a chain of events that none of them would be able to stop. He was just a man fixing a fence in the cold. He was just trying to make things a little more solid than he'd found them. That was all he'd ever known how to do. And sometimes not always, not even often, but sometimes that turns out to be exactly enough. The fence was fixed by 7:30. Silas didn't go back inside right away. He walked the perimeter of the property, instead not because anyone asked him to, not because he had a plan forming yet, just because walking ground was how he thought. He'd always been that way. His father used to say that Silas could work out a problem in a quarter mile that would take most men an afternoon sitting at a table. The property was larger than it looked from the road. The inn itself sat at the front, with the barn and several outbuildings arranged behind it in a pattern that made sense once you understood the original thinking, easy access to the road for guests, with the working parts of the operation tucked away behind. Whoever had designed the layout knew what they were doing. That was maybe 30 years ago, Silas guessed, based on the age of the timber. What wasn't working was the east pasture fence, which he'd already addressed. And the water trough near the barn had a slow leak at the seam that would become a real problem by spring. And one of the outbuilding roofs had shed enough shingles in the storm that it was going to take water in the next hard rain. He wasn't cataloging problems. He was just noticing things. It was the habit he couldn't break. He went in for breakfast. The dining room held 4 people at that hour, 2 overnight guests he didn't know, a ranch hand eating fast before heading out, and a man named Holt, who Silas would come to understand was Elowen's ranch manager. Holt was somewhere around 50, built like someone had stacked lumber carefully into a human shape, with a gray mustache that he kept touching with his thumb the way men touch things they're uncertain about. Holt looked at Silas the way a territorial animal looks at something that's walked into its range. Silas sat down, accepted coffee from the young woman who brought it without being asked, and ate his breakfast without trying to make conversation. He'd learned early in life that some silences were invitations and some were tests, and the smartest move was usually to let the other person decide which one this was. It was Holt who spoke first. "Heard you fixed the east fence. It needed doing. That's my job." Silas looked at him. "Storm knocked it over last night. You weren't available. Fence doesn't know who's supposed to fix it." Holt's jaw tightened slightly. He looked at his coffee cup. "How long you planning to stay?" "Haven't worked that out yet. You got work somewhere?" "Before here, I mean." "Had a ranch." "Had." That's what I said. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when 2 men have said enough to understand each other, but not enough to decide whether they're going to be a problem for each other. Holt touched his mustache again. Silas drank his coffee. Elowen appeared from the kitchen with a plate she set down in front of him, eggs, salt pork, a piece of bread that was yesterday's but still decent. She poured her own coffee and stood at the end of the table for a moment. "Holt," she said, The north outbuilding lost shingles last night. Can you get up there today? Got the Delaney delivery coming this afternoon. Then after. Ground's going to be frozen, I know. She said it like she'd already considered that and found it insufficient as an objection. After the delivery, Holt nodded, but the kind of nodding that stops just short of agreeing. Silas ate his eggs and said nothing. But he'd seen the small gap between what Elowen needed done and what Holt was going to get around to. Not malice, not laziness exactly. Something slower and more insidious than either the accumulated drift of a man who'd been the authority on a property for long enough that being redirected felt like a demotion, even when the redirection was completely reasonable. He filed it away and kept eating. The children came down 40 minutes later. Cal found his way to the kitchen doorway within 60 seconds and stood there looking in with the particular expression of a child who is trying to appear casual about something he desperately wants. The woman in the kitchen, an older woman named Beshid, took one look at him and handed him a piece of bread with apple butter on it without a word being exchanged. Cal ate it with the focused reverence of someone receiving something sacred. Lydia sat across from Silas with a piece of paper she'd found somewhere and a stub of pencil, and she was already working on something. She'd been writing since she was 7, not stories, but lists, inventories, careful columns of things observed and accounted for. Margaret used to call it Lydia's ledger brain, and she'd meant it as a compliment. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Things the building needs," she said. He looked at her. "You walked the property?" "Just looked out the window." She turned the paper so he could see it. 6 items, written in her small, careful hand. The shingles, the water trough. 2 more things he'd noticed himself, and 2 he hadn't. "How'd you see the drainage ditch from the window?" "I didn't. I could hear the water running wrong when we walked in last night, going the wrong direction somewhere. Makes a particular sound." Silas stared at his daughter for a moment. She was 10 years old. She had her mother's ears for things being subtly wrong, and his eyes for property problems, and some third quality that belonged entirely to herself, a patience with detail that neither of her parents had possessed in quite that form. "Good list," he said. "There's probably more," she said, and went back to writing. He stayed 3 more days on that first understanding, meaning no understanding at all, just the wordless agreement of 2 people who weren't going to have the conversation about departure, because the conversation about departure would require one of them to initiate it, and neither of them did. Elowen didn't ask him to leave. Silas didn't announce that he was staying. He worked because there was work, and she let him because it got done. The outbuilding roof got its shingles. Silas did it the morning after the storm, before Holt got to it, because the next assistance was visible on the northern horizon, and waiting until after the Delaney delivery was a gamble with someone else's property. Holt came around the corner, while Silas was coming down the ladder, and stood there with an expression that moved through several emotions quickly, landing finally on something that wasn't gratitude and wasn't resentment, but contained elements of both. "You work fast," Holt said. "Weather was coming. I was going to get to it." "I know." Silas put the ladder back where he'd found it. "I was closer to it." That was the thing about Holt. He wasn't a bad man. Silas had known bad men, had worked alongside a few and been cheated by others. And Holt wasn't one of them. He was a man who'd been in his position long enough to confuse his authority with his competence, which was a problem entirely and a harder one to fix. By the end of the first week, Silas had repaired the water trough, rebalanced the drainage along the south side of the barn, identified a slow rot in 2 of the corral posts that would need replacing before summer, and spent 3 evenings refitting a saddle from the tack room that had been sitting misused long enough that someone had worked it into a shape a horse shouldn't have to carry. He did all of this without being asked and without discussing it. He simply found things and addressed them. Elowen noticed. He could tell she noticed because she started leaving him coffee outside before he went to the barn in the morning, not a word about it. Just the cup there on the post when he came out the back door. It was such a small thing. He thought about it more than he should have. On the 8th day, she found him in the tack room and stood in the doorway the way she stood in doorways, like she'd decided something before arriving and was giving herself a moment to confirm it. "I'd like to offer you an arrangement," she said. He set down the bridle he was working on. "All right, room and board for you and the children, plus a small wage I can actually afford, which isn't much. In exchange for everything you've been doing, done formally instead of done. Because you can't stop yourself. He almost smiled at that last part. Almost. What about Holt? Holt manages the cattle and the range operation. You'd be handling the property buildings, horses, equipment, the immediate infrastructure. She paused. He won't like it, I noticed. He'll come around or he won't. That's his business. Another pause, shorter. Do you want the arrangement or not? He thought about it. He genuinely thought about it for about 15 seconds, which was long enough to consider whether this was the kind of offer that complicated things more than it solved them. A man with nothing accepts help and keeps owing. A man with a wage earns his own way, which was a different thing entirely. Yes, he said. She nodded, not pleased, exactly satisfied, which was different. The children are welcome to stay as long as needed. Lydia's been helping Bess in the kitchen 3 mornings. I'd rather formalize that too. She's 10. She's been adding up the breakfast accounts in her head faster than Bess can write them down. I'd rather pay her something than pretend I don't notice. He didn't have an answer for that, except the truth. She'd like that. She won't say so, but she'd like it. I know, Elowen said, and then she was gone. Cal, for his part, had attached himself to the barn with the single-mindedness of a child who has discovered his natural habitat. Kandasba. He followed Silas through the morning chores with the intensity of an apprentice who couldn't write yet, but was taking mental notes regardless. He asked questions the way breathing constantly, without apparent fatigue. Why does Tuesday eat before the others? She doesn't. She just eats faster. Why does the roan over there kick at feeding time? Because somebody spooked her bad when she was young, and she never entirely forgot it. Can you fix that? Sometimes. Takes time. How much time? Different for each horse. Depends on how bad it was and how patient you are. Cal absorbed this. I'm patient, he said in the tone of someone stating a simple fact. Silas looked at his son, 6 years old. Covered in hay, completely at home in a barn that wasn't theirs in a town they'd never heard of 3 weeks ago. Yeah, he said. You are. The second week, the weather broke and the town of Red Willow Crossing came back to itself. Supply wagons moved again. Neighbors visited. The inn filled up on 2 evenings with local ranchers and their wives coming in for dinner, which was apparently a winter tradition, when the worst of the cold let up briefly between systems. And that was when Silas first understood what Varric meant to this valley. He was at the long table in the corner the first evening, eating late after the main rush, when he started picking up pieces of conversations from the ranchers nearby. Not eavesdropping. He wasn't built for deliberate subtlety, just listening the way you listen when you're in a room and people are talking. The way you can't stop yourself from noticing things. What he heard was this. 3 families in the valley had sold land to Varric in the last 4 years. 2 more were reportedly in conversations with him. The sales were always preceded by the same sequence: a bad season, a financing offer from Varric that seemed reasonable, and then terms that gradually revealed themselves to be something other than reasonable once the papers were signed. One man, a rancher named Eustace Pell, was 3 years into a lease arrangement with Varric on land that had once been entirely his own. The way Eustace described it carefully to his neighbor, in the particular quiet voice of a man who's ashamed of something he feels he should have seen coming, the lease meant he could work the land but couldn't make improvements without Varric's approval, couldn't sell without Varric's right of first refusal, and couldn't access the creek at the south end between April and September, which were the exact months that mattered. Silas ate his food and filed every word. He didn't say anything that night. He wasn't in a position to say anything, and more importantly, he didn't yet understand enough to be useful. But he lay awake for a long time after the children were asleep, turning the shape of what he was starting to see. Varric wasn't buying land. He was buying the water beneath it and the access around it, and the land came with the purchase whether he particularly wanted it or not. What he was building ranch by ranch, agreement by agreement, was a system where no one in the valley could operate independently, where everyone's water, access, and financing ran through him. He almost had it complete. Almost. The piece he was still missing was the western edge of Elowen Hartwell's property. Silas didn't know that yet, specifically. But he was starting to understand the shape of the thing. The way you understand the shape of a fence line before you see the posts, by the way it determines where you can and can't go. The next morning, he started paying different attention. He'd been walking the property casually, until then noticing building problems, animal problems, immediate practical things. Now he walked it with his eyes lower. He walked the fence lines properly, corner to corner. He looked at where the water moved and where it didn't. He looked at the land's tilt and the old berm patterns that told you where someone had once moved earth deliberately. The eastern pasture was in reasonable shape. The northern grazing land was good, if a little thin from the previous summer. The western 40 acres were something else. The grass there was poor, thin and brown and stubborn, the kind of growth that means the land isn't dead, but it isn't happy. The soil was dry in a way that didn't entirely match the snowmelt, which was strange. Most land this time of year carried moisture easily. This didn't, and there were cottonwood trees, old ones. 3 of them in a rough line, running northwest to southeast across the failing pasture, and then 2 more at the far edge, near the property boundary. Cottonwoods grew where water was, or had been. They didn't grow in patterns like this by accident. They followed something. Silas stood in the middle of the western pasture and looked at those trees for a long time. Then he got down on one knee and started digging with his hands in the frozen ground near the base of the largest one. He found what he was looking for about 18 inches down the edge of a stone-lined channel, packed full of silt and years of deadfall, but still there. Still structurally present. Still running in exactly the direction that would make sense if you were bringing snowmelt down from the ridge above and distributing it across 40 acres of pasture. He sat back and looked at the channel, and then at the trees, and then at the ridge. Someone, maybe 50 years ago, maybe longer, had built an irrigation system on this land. And at some point a bad flood, maybe, or just the slow accumulation of neglect after an owner died or moved on it, had silted over and been forgotten. The land wasn't exhausted. The land was thirsty. He went back to the inn and found Elowen in the small office off the kitchen, where she kept her ledgers. She was running numbers that were clearly not adding up the way she wanted them to, because she had the look of someone having a private argument with arithmetic. "Do you have survey maps of the property?" he asked. She looked up. "What kind?" "Original. The ones from when the land was first claimed and recorded." She thought about this. "There might be something in the storage room. My husband's papers. I haven't gone through all of it. Can I look?" Something shifted in her expression, not suspicion exactly, but caution. The particular caution of a person who's been asked to open something they've kept closed. "What are you looking for?" "I want to know where the water came from," he said. "The original water. Before whatever happened to that west pasture." She held his gaze for a moment. "Everyone says that land's played out. Everyone's wrong." She studied him. People didn't tell Elowen Hartwell that everyone was wrong very often, and when they did, they usually softened it into something more diplomatic. He hadn't done that. He'd just said it plainly, the way you say a fence post is rotted not to be dramatic, just because it was the accurate thing to say. "The storage room is off the far end of the hall," she said finally. "The maps, if there are any, would be in the flat wooden box on the second shelf." He found the box. The maps were there, rolled dry brittle at the edges, but intact. East of its windows were dark. He spread them on the floor of the storage room and crouched over them with a lantern and spent the better part of 2 hours cross-referencing what he'd seen in the pasture with what the original surveys described. It was there, documented, clear as anything an irrigation channel, fed from the snowmelt creek that ran along the ridge to the northwest, designed to water exactly the 40 acres he'd been standing in that morning. The survey notes in the margin, written in a hand so old the ink had gone brown, described it as a primary water improvement, constructed 1841. 40 years of silt. 40 years of everyone assuming the land was the problem. He brought the maps to Elowen the next morning and laid them on the kitchen table. She leaned over them while Bess made noise with pots on the stove and Cal sat in the corner explaining something complicated to a barn cat that wasn't listening. "Here," Silas said, and pointed to the channel line on the original survey. "And here's where it runs." He traced the cottonwood line on a rough sketch he'd made. The channel's still there, silted over, packed down, but the stonework's intact. The grade's right. If we excavate it, open the head gate up at the ridge, clear the channel that water hits the west pasture. Elowen looked at the survey, then at his sketch, then at the survey again. "How much would it cost?" she asked. labor mostly. Some supplies for the head gate if the original's too far gone. He'd been working this out in his head since yesterday afternoon. It's not small. We'd need to hire men. Week's work. Maybe 10 days if the ground's difficult. I don't have that kind of money loose, I know. He'd suspected as much from watching her run numbers. But here's the thing. Varick's been trying to buy that pasture. He's made you offers before, Holt told me. 3 offers, she said. Her voice had gone flat, each one lower than the last. He keeps making lower offers, because every season the land looks worse, and every season he can tell you it's more depleted than before. That's the play. Wait until you're desperate enough to take whatever he gives. Silas looked at her directly. He knows something about that land, Mrs. Hartwell. He's known for a while. She was very still. He knows about the channel. Bet on it. The kitchen went quiet except for Bess's pots and Cal's ongoing monologue to the cat. Elowen looked at the survey map, and her expression did something complicated, the kind of thing that happens on a person's face when they're rearranging their understanding of events they thought they'd already processed. He sat in this room, she said, slowly. 4 years ago when he made the first offer, sat right at this table, and told me that Western pasture was alkali soil, said nothing would recover it, said I was holding on to dead land out of sentiment, and he was doing me a favor taking it. He was lying. He sat in my kitchen and lied to my face. He did. The flatness in her voice had shifted into something that wasn't quite anger, but was the ground anger comes from a cold, settled clarity that was in some ways more dangerous than heat. Silas had seen that quality in a few people in his life, and he'd always respected it more than shouting. What do you need? She said. He hadn't expected the conversation to move this fast. He'd prepared for more resistance, more of the reasonable caution of someone being asked to spend money they didn't have on a gamble. You're sure? He asked. What do you need? She said again, patient and immovable. He told her. Workers, he knew 2 men in town who were reliable and would work for fair wages. A specific type of shovel for silt work, which the general store likely had or could order. A week of his own time redirected from the regular property work, which would mean some things didn't get done that usually did. And 1 trip up to the ridge to assess the original head gate before they committed to any of it. She nodded through each item. And Holt? He asked. She thought about that. Tell him yourself. Man to man. He'll respect that more than hearing it from me. He's not going to like it. He's not going to like a lot of things this spring, she said, in a tone that suggested she'd already accepted that and moved on. The conversation with Holt happened that afternoon. In the barn, which was Holt's territory, and Silas knew it was Holt's territory and chose it anyway because it was the kind of gesture that mattered to men like Holt. You came to their ground, not the other way around. He laid it out straight. The channel. The maps, the cottonwood line, what he thought the excavations would accomplish, and what it would cost in time and money. Holt listened with the expression of a man being told that something he's believed for years was incorrect, which is one of the harder things a person can be asked to sit with. He'd managed this property through 2 owners now. He knew every fence post and water source and grazing rotation. Being told that 40 acres had been misunderstood on his watch was not a comfortable thing. I've walked that pasture 100 times, Holt said finally. So have I, and I almost missed it. The channel's 18 inches down and running perpendicular to what you'd expect. You'd only find it if you were looking for cottonwood root patterns. You were looking for cottonwood root patterns. It's a specific thing. I'm not saying you should have caught it. Holt touched his mustache, looked at Tuesday in the 4th stall. Mrs. Hartwell's decided to do this? She has. Then I suppose it gets done. He said it without enthusiasm, but without obstruction, which was about the best Silas had realistically hoped for. You'll need Creddy and his brother for the silt work. They're slow, but they don't damage stonework. You know them? Known them 15 years. He finally looked at Silas directly. I'll introduce you. They'll take my word on your judgment easier than a stranger's. It was the closest thing to an offer of partnership that Holt was going to make, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it. Silas hired Creddy and his brother the next day. Lydia, who had by this point officially taken on 3 mornings a week, managing the supply receipts with a seriousness that made Bess shake her head in fond bewilderment, made a careful accounting of the projected costs in a column alongside the projected water benefit. She presented it to Elowen with the gravity of a professional 3 times her age. Elowen looked at it for a long time. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked. "Watching my mother," Lydia said. "She kept Papa's ranch accounts. She was good at it?" Lydia paused. "She was the reason the ranch lasted as long as it did," she said carefully, which was the truest and most complicated thing she could have said, and she clearly knew it. Elowen folded the accounting carefully and put it in her ledger. She didn't say anything, but she put it somewhere that mattered. The excavation began on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into Silas's time at Northwind House. The work was hard frozen ground. I have two stretches where the channel had partially collapsed and needed to be shored up with fresh timber before they could clear it. Credy's brother, a silent man named Drum who communicated mostly in nods, turned out to have the best instincts for stonework Silas had encountered outside of a professional mason. He moved rocks with a patience and precision that saved them 2 full days of rework. Cal watched from the fence line every afternoon after the morning chores, offering commentary that nobody had requested, but nobody found unwelcome either. He'd worked out, in his 6-year-old engineering mind, that the channel needed to be cleared like a blocked nose, which was a more accurate analogy than he knew. On the 6th day, they opened the head gate. It was a moment Silas would remember for a long time, not because it was dramatic, not at first. It started as just a seeping. Cold brown water pressing through the newly cleared gate, moving slow and uncertain into the channel like something that had forgotten what it was for. Then it found its grade. Silas stood at the bottom end of the channel with Elowen and watched the water come. It moved through the first bend, then the long straight, then the curve that ran alongside the 3 old cottonwoods. It spread into the distribution trenches that Credy's crew had cleared that morning. It reached the west pasture. Elowen didn't say anything. She stood with her arms crossed and her coat collar turned up against the March wind and watched water move across 40 acres of land that everyone had told her was dead. Her face was doing the complicated thing again, but this time it was moving towards something that wasn't entirely grief and wasn't entirely relief and wasn't entirely anger at having been deceived. It was all of those things compressed together, which is the expression people make when several years of events suddenly reveal their real shape. "It's going to take weeks before you see any green," Silas said. "I know, and more weeks before it's actually productive pasture. I know that too. But the water's right, the land's right. It'll come." She was quiet for a moment. "Then Varric is going to know within the week, probably sooner. He's not going to take this quietly." Silas looked at the water moving through the old channel. The cottonwoods stood along its length like they'd been waiting, which in some sense they had their roots. Finding what was coming before the surface showed anything at all. "No," he said, "he's not." He said it without particular drama, because it wasn't dramatic. It was simply the next fact in a sequence of facts. Varric would move, and when Varric moved, they would need to be ready. What Silas did not yet fully appreciate, what none of them fully appreciated, standing in that cold pasture, watching water find its way back to land that had been waiting for, it was how quickly ready would need to be. 3 days later, one of Varric's men rode up to the property line and sat on his horse, looking at the west pasture for a long time. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't need to. That evening, Holt came to find Silas Enns in the barn, and the expression on his face was one Silas recognized immediately, the particular look of a man who's been offered something he shouldn't have been offered. "Varric's man came to see me today," Holt said. He stood in the barn doorway with his hat in his hand and his jaw working like he was chewing on something he didn't want to swallow. After he rode the property line, Silas set down what he was doing. "What did he offer you?" Holt looked at the hat in his hands. "Position managing his new consolidated range operation. Twice what Mrs. Hartwell pays." He paused. He said the Northwind would be his before summer and he wanted his own people in the management structure. The barn was quiet, except for horses shifting in their stalls. "What did you tell him?" Silas asked. Holt was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the 4th stall, where Tuesday stood with her ears, watching them both, with the patient attention of a horse that understands more than horses are supposed to. "I told him," Holt said slowly, "that I'd managed this property for 11 years, and I wasn't interested in managing anything that didn't belong to the woman who gave me this job when nobody else would." He put his hat back on, And then I told him some other things that I probably shouldn't repeat. Silas looked at him. Holt's jaw was still set, and his eyes were still doing that thing they did when he was chewing on something uncomfortable, but underneath all of it was something that had shifted since the first morning they'd eaten breakfast across from each other in uneasy silence. "You should have told her before you told me," Silas said. "I know. I'm telling you first, because I figured you'd know how to say it without it becoming a whole thing. It's going to become a whole thing." "Yeah." Holt exhaled. "I know that too." He went and told Elowen. Silas stayed in the barn and brushed Tuesday and thought about the shape of what was coming. Varric had moved faster than he'd expected, which meant the water in the west pasture had scared him more than the water itself should have, which meant there was something about that pasture and that water that Silas still didn't fully understand. He went back to the maps. He spread them on the barn floor this time, with a lantern and his rough sketch of the channel alongside. And he looked at the property lines and the water rights notations in the margins and the old survey notes in their brown faded ink until something caught. The creek at the ridge, the source of the channel, didn't originate on Elowen's property. It came from higher ground to the northwest. It ran across a narrow strip of land that had once been part of a larger original claim subdivided decades ago. Most of its windows were dark, and according to the survey notes, the water rights associated with the channel were recorded independently from the land rights, meaning they traveled with the documented irrigation improvement, not with the current ownership of the surrounding range. He looked at those notes for a long time. Then he understood why Varric wanted that pasture so badly, and why the water scared him so deeply, and why the offers had been getting lower and more urgent rather than higher and more patient. If the water rights were intact and properly recorded, they belonged entirely to Northwind House, regardless of who owned the land at the ridge, regardless of what Varric had purchased in the valley, regardless of every quiet deal and overlapping agreement he'd assembled over 4 years. Elowen Hartwell was sitting on water rights that didn't just serve her property. They potentially superseded his. Silas sat in the barn with that knowledge for a long moment. Tuesday moved in her stall. The lantern flickered in a draft from the gap under the door. The fence they were up against had just gotten higher, and the man on the other side of it had just gotten a lot more dangerous. He didn't tell Elowen that night. That wasn't cowardice, or at least he told himself it wasn't. It was the particular caution of a man who understood that information delivered too fast, without proper framing, had a way of becoming panic rather than strategy. Elowen was already dealing with the news about Holt and Varric's approach. Adding the water rights discoveries on top of that, at 9 in the evening with the wind coming back up outside, and the ledgers still open on her desk, felt like loading a wagon past its weight and then asking it to go uphill. He needed to understand what he had before he handed it to her. So he spent the next 2 days doing something he hadn't done since the bankruptcy proceedings that had taken his ranch. He read legal documents carefully. The original survey records had marginal notations that referenced a secondary filing at the Territorial Land Office in Helena. He couldn't get to Helena, but he could write. He drafted a letter to the land office, requesting copies of any water rights documentation associated with the channel improvement recorded on the Northwind property survey dated 1841. He gave the letter to the outgoing mail rider without telling anyone what was in it. Then he went back to work, and he watched, and he waited. Varric didn't wait with him. The first move came 8 days after the water had reached the west pasture. A man Silas didn't recognize rode into town and went directly to the county assessor's office, and by late afternoon word had moved through Red Willow, crossing the way words always moved through small towns quietly and completely. Varric had filed a formal challenge to the boundary survey on the northwest corner of the Northwind property. His claim was that the original survey had an error in the bearing line, which, if accepted, would move the property boundary far enough to put the headgate of the irrigation channel on land that was no longer Elowen's. It was elegant, in the way that particularly dishonest things sometimes are. He wasn't claiming the channel. He wasn't claiming the water. He was claiming a surveying error from 40 years ago that, if proved, would make both of those questions moot. Silas heard about it from Holt, who'd heard it from the man at the feed store, who'd heard it directly from someone who'd been in the assessor's office when the paperwork was filed. He found Elowen in the office and told her plainly. She went very still in the way she went still when something was bad. Not frozen still, like a person gathering weight before they moved. Can he prove a survey error that doesn't exist? She asked. He doesn't need to prove it. He needs to create enough legal dispute that it has to go before a territorial hearing. That process takes months. It costs money. And while it's ongoing, any development or sale of that pasture is clouded. He paused. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make the fight expensive enough that you settle. Settle means sell. At whatever he offers when you're tired and broke. She looked at the wall above her desk, where a small framed photograph sat a man in his 40s, square-shouldered, with a serious expression that was clearly trying not to be fond. Her husband, Thomas Hartwell, who'd built Northwind House from a single room and a dream that had outpaced his health by about 15 years. She looked at that photograph, at things they're drawing strength from, and then she looked back at Silas. What do we do? She said. We get our own survey done before his challenge can establish a baseline. Most of its windows were dark. We find the best land surveyor in the territory who isn't connected to Varick in any way, and we bring him out here before the snow's fully gone, and we put our own markers down with a witness and a written record. That costs money, less than a territorial hearing. She thought about it. He could see her running numbers in her head, the way she always did, the particular expression of someone whose arithmetic was never entirely in their favor, but who was going to work with what they had, regardless. Do you know a surveyor? She asked. I know of one. Name of Aldous Crane. He worked the Northern Pacific Railroad survey 3 years back. Completely independent. Varick doesn't have a hold on him because Crane doesn't operate in this county. Ordinarily, I'd have to be brought in. Silas had worked this out over the previous 2 days, anticipating exactly this moment. It'll take 10 days to get him here. Probably 2 days of field work. His fee is $40. $40, she repeated. The way she said it told him everything about what $40 meant to her current account balance. It's $40 or a hearing that costs 10 times that and takes 6 months. She opened the desk drawer, took out the household ledger, not the operations ledger, the household one, the personal one, opened it to a page he couldn't read from his angle, looked at it for a moment. Write the letter to Crane, she said. She closed the ledger and put it away. Tonight, if you can. He wrote it that night at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Elowen sat across from him with her own correspondence, and neither of them talked much, but silence was the kind that comes from two people working on the same problem from different angles, which was a different quality of silence than the careful early ones had been. At one point she looked up and said, without particular preamble, "Why are you doing all of this?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You could be looking for another ranch position somewhere. You have skills. You have a reputation, I'm learning, from people who knew you before." She held his gaze. "You rode into this town in a blizzard with nothing. You could be rebuilding somewhere else. Why are you spending your energy on my fight?" He considered several answers. He thought about the easy ones, the job, the arrangement, the roof over his children's heads, and he discarded them because she deserved better than the easy ones. Because Varick stood in your lobby and told you your worth in front of a room full of people, he said. And because men like him operate on this assumption that nobody's going to fight back, that everyone's going to do the arithmetic on the cost of resistance and decide it's too high. He set down the pen. I spent a year doing that arithmetic. On the ranch, with the creditors, with the bank, every time I worked out that the fight was too expensive and the smart thing was to accept what was happening. He looked at the letter he'd been writing. I'm tired of doing that arithmetic. Elowen looked at him for a long moment. That's not entirely about me, she said. No, he agreed. It's not entirely about you. She went back to her correspondence. He went back to the letter. The fire in the stove burned down to coals, and neither of them mentioned it. Aldous Crane arrived 12 days later, 2 days past his estimated arrival, because a mudslide on the Helena Road had added a day, and bad luck on the second day's ride had added another. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with a particular tan of someone who spent most of his professional life outdoors, and the particular squint of someone who'd spent most of it looking at things exactly. He carried his equipment in cases that he handled with more care than he handled himself, and he shook Silas's hand with the grip of a man who'd spent decades driving stakes into resistant ground. You wrote that there's a disputed boundary, he said. There's a manufactured dispute about a boundary that isn't actually disputed, Silas corrected. Crane's squint deepened slightly. Show me the original survey documentation. He spent the first evening reviewing the maps and survey notes at the kitchen table. He asked questions, occasionally precise, technical questions that told Silas he was dealing with someone who actually knew what they were doing. Lydia, who had been given permission to stay up past her normal hour because she'd specifically asked to watch the professional at work, sat in the corner and observed with the focused attention. She gave everything she found genuinely instructive. At one point, Crane looked up and noticed her. You understand what I'm doing? He asked. You're checking whether the original bearing points match current fixed landmarks, she said. If they do, the survey is accurate. If they don't, you have to determine whether the landmarks moved or the survey was wrong. Crane looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Silas. Yours? Yes. He looked back at Lydia. How old are you? 10. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went back to his maps. The field work took 3 days. Not 2, the northwest corner was on difficult ground, partially wooded, with the benchmark markers that should have been in the tree line either gone or buried. Crane worked methodically, unhurriedly, with the patience of a man who understood that doing it right once was faster than doing it, approximately twice. Silas helped carry equipment and held stakes when needed and answered questions about what he'd observed in the channel excavation. On the third afternoon, Crane drove the final stake and straightened up and looked at the line he'd established. Survey's accurate, he said. Original bearing was set off a rock formation at the ridge that's still there and still measurable. The boundary runs exactly where the original documentation says it runs. He looked at the head gate of the channel, which was clearly inside that boundary by a comfortable margin. Whoever's claiming an error either hasn't looked at the ridge formation or is hoping you haven't. The latter, Silas said. Crane nodded like this didn't particularly surprise him. I'll file a countering survey statement with the Territorial Land Office and the county assessor, properly witnessed and sealed. He began breaking down his equipment. It won't dismiss the challenge immediately, but it establishes a competing professional record. Any hearing will have to weigh both. Will the hearing go through? Elowen asked. She'd come out to the field for the last hour, standing in the thin April sun with her coat open, because the afternoon had finally gotten warm enough to allow it. With a competing survey filed by a credentialed professional, the challenge becomes considerably harder to sustain. Crane latched the case. These boundary disputes rely on the appearance of genuine uncertainty. You've made it look considerably less uncertain. Varick's response to the countering survey came faster than Silas expected within the week, which meant Varick had people watching the assessor's office for exactly this development. His response was to escalate. Instead of just the boundary challenge, he now filed a formal request for a comprehensive property inspection of the Northwind holdings, citing concerns about operational compliance with territorial land use regulations. It was, as far as Silas could tell, almost entirely invented. There were territorial regulations that applied, technically, to commercial properties of a certain size, but the inspection process had rarely been used against anyone who wasn't already in genuine violation of something real. The inspection itself would be conducted by a territorial assessor who would spend a day or two on the property looking at everything from building conditions to water usage to grazing practices to financial record keeping. If they found enough problems, and with a motivated inspector and a motivated man financing the process, they could always find enough problems they could impose fines, require expensive remediation, or in extreme cases recommend suspension of operating licenses. It was a second front, opened deliberately to stretch Elowen's resources across 2 fights simultaneously. Silas sat with that for most of an evening and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. He wasn't angry exactly. He was something colder than angry. The assessment of a man looking at a problem and deciding the problem was actually an opportunity if you looked at it correctly. Varick had just handed him a reason to do something he'd been thinking about since the dinner when he'd overheard Eustace Pell talking about his lease. He went to Elowen the next morning. The inspection, he said. Don't fight it. Welcome it. She looked at him like he'd suggested something mildly concerning. Welcome it. Every legitimate problem on this property gets fixed before the inspector arrives. Every record gets organized. Every operational practice gets documented properly. He could see her starting to follow this. When the inspector shows up expecting to find a struggling property held together with baling wire, he finds a well-maintained, improving operation with documented water rights, a completed irrigation restoration, and a financial record that's as clean as we can make it. "We have 6 weeks until the scheduled inspection date," she said. 6 weeks is enough. Silas. She said his name the way she said it when she thought he was being optimistic, past the point of usefulness. The roof on the north barn needs full replacement, not just the shingles. The corral posts you identified need to be out and reset. I know the list. I made the list. He'd been keeping a running inventory of every deferred maintenance item on the property since his first week. What's on that list is fixable in 6 weeks if we work it right. What I need from you is the financial documentation, every record, going back as far as you have it, organized by category, dated, witnessed where possible. She thought about the storage room and her husband's papers and the boxes she hadn't opened. That's weeks of work on its own. Lydia will help you. A pause. She's a child. She's been running your supply accounts for 2 months. She's faster at organizing financial records than most adults I've encountered. He held Elowen's gaze. Let her help. Elowen looked out the window at the west pasture, where the first faint green was beginning, not grass yet, not quite, but the particular slight change in color and texture that meant things were happening underground. It had taken 3 weeks from the first water to get to this point, which was actually faster than Silas had expected. "All right," she said, "but I want to be working alongside her. I won't hand my husband's papers to a 10-year-old and walk away. I didn't suggest that, I know. I'm saying it anyway." The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest Silas had worked since the driest year on his own ranch, when he'd spent 3 months hauling water by hand to keep 20 head alive. He and Holt's change, since the night he'd reported Varick's bribe approach, had been genuine, if not dramatic. He was still prickly, still territorial about his domain, but he worked now like someone who decided whose side he was on, attacked the maintenance list with the systematic intensity of 2 men who understood that the alternative was losing. The north barn roof came first because it was the most visible problem and the most structurally urgent. Silas had roofed enough buildings to know that the job was brutal on your back and required a second person with good instincts about where weight should be distributed. Holt turned out to be that second person. They worked 2 full days on that roof, not talking much, which, by this point, was just how they worked side by side in a silence that had long since stopped being hostile and had become instead the comfortable wordlessness of 2 people who'd figured out how to be useful to each other without needing to discuss it. The corral posts were reset over 3 days with Creddy's help. The drainage issues along the barn's south wall were addressed properly, not the temporary fix Silas had done January, but a proper French drain that would handle snowmelt for years. 2 outbuilding doors that had been hanging wrong since before Silas's arrival were rehung. The well cover that had cracked was replaced. The signage on the front of the inn, faded to near illegibility, was repainted by Drum, who turned out to have a precise hand with a brush that suggested hidden dimensions. Cal watched most of this with intense interest and was eventually assigned the specific job of keeping track of which tools were where, a task he took so seriously that by the end of the 2nd week, nobody could misplace a hammer within 30 feet of him. Inside, Elowen and Lydia worked through the storage room and the desk files and the boxes of Thomas Hartwell's papers with a thoroughness that turned the office into a sorting operation for most of 3 weeks. Silas passed through occasionally and saw the 2 of them at the big kitchen table, surrounded by documents, Lydia making notes in her careful columns, while Elowen read documents aloud and dated them and answered questions. He saw more than once Elowen stop mid-document and sit quietly for a moment, a paper that her husband had written, or a record from the early years of the inn, when everything was being built from nothing. And Lydia would wait without saying anything, not pretending the pause wasn't happening, just giving it its proper space. It was a quality of presence that Silas didn't know how to explain Kenson in a 10-year-old, except to say that she'd learned it from watching grief up close, which was a terrible way to learn kindness, but sometimes the way it happened. 3 weeks into the 6th, Silas received a response from the Helena land office. He read it twice in the barn, where he'd gone to be alone with it, for a few minutes before deciding what it meant. Then he read it a third time, slowly paying attention to every phrase. The water rights associated with the 1,841 channel improvement on the Northwind property had been recorded as an appurtenant right, meaning they were attached to the land's use and improvement, not to any individual. The recording was valid. The right had never been transferred, never been challenged, never been extinguished through non-use, because the physical improvement the channel itself had remained structurally present even during the decades of silt accumulation. And there was a second document included, which the land office clerk had attached without specific comment, but which told Silas the clerk understood exactly what it was. It was a map of the watershed. The creek that fed the channel ran from the ridge through a narrow strip of rangeland that Varick had purchased. 2 years ago, he'd presumably bought it, thinking it would give him control of the water source for the channel that he intended to acquire along with the west pasture. But the appurtenant water right, properly recorded, meant that Varick's ownership of the land the creek ran through gave him exactly nothing in terms of the water itself. The right to that water for irrigation purposes, in the amounts documented in the original improvement filing, belonged to whoever held the Northwind property. Varick hadn't bought access to the water. He'd bought a strip of land with a creek on it that he couldn't use to his intended purpose because the downstream water right was someone else's, and had been since 1841. Silas sat down on a hay bale and stared at the documents. He'd known Varick was building something. He'd seen the shape of it, the accumulated land purchases, the lease agreements, the financing traps, the whole architecture of control that Varick had been assembling for 4 years in this valley. And he'd understood that the west pasture was the missing piece. What he hadn't fully understood until this moment was why. Varick needed the west pasture not just for the land and not just for the channel. He needed the registered water right that came with it. Without that right properly transferred and documented, his entire consolidated operation on the valley's western range had a hole in it that no amount of purchased land could fill. He could own every acre from the ridge to the east road. But if the irrigation right upstream was held by Northwind House, his cattle empire had a water problem that would follow it forever. He'd been trying to buy the legal right, not just the land. And Elowen, who didn't know the right existed in this specific form, had been on the verge of selling it to him for less than it was worth by orders of magnitude. Silas folded the documents and put them in his coat pocket and went to find Elowen. He found her in the office with Lydia, both of them deep in a section of Thomas Hartwell's original operating agreements. He asked Lydia to give them a few minutes. She looked at him with the particular perception of a child who understands that a few minutes means something significant is about to happen, and she left without argument, closing the door behind her. He put the land office documents on the desk. He told Elowen what they said, all of it the appurtenant right, what it meant specifically in relation to Varick's purchases, and what it meant for the inspection and the boundary challenge and the entire sequence of pressure that been north of pressure that and Northwind property for the past several weeks. Elowen read the documents herself. Slowly, he waited. When she finished, she set them down and was quiet for a moment that ran longer than most of her silences, which were already not short. He's been trying to buy this for 4 years, she said finally. Yes, and he knew what it was. Has to have. A man who structures deals the way he structures them, who moves the way he moves. He had someone research the water rights before he made the first offer. He knew what he was making offers on. He sat in my kitchen, she said. The same words she'd used before. About the lie he'd told her about the alkali soil, but a different weight behind them now. Before it had been about deception. Now it was about the full scope of what she'd nearly lost without knowing she was losing it. He did, Silas said. She stood up, walked to the window. The west pasture was visible from this angle, green now, genuinely green, the grass coming back in uneven patches that made it look like what it actually was, which was land recovering rather than land performing. It wasn't pretty, it was real, which was better. What do we do with this? She asked. Document it properly. Get it in front of a territorial attorney, someone completely independent of Varick. He'd been thinking about this since the barn. The boundary challenge and the inspection request both look different once there's a registered attorney involved and the water rights documentation is properly submitted. Varick is filing nuisance actions against a widow running a struggling inn. He's not going to want to file them against a property with a documented superior water right and legal representation. Attorneys cost money. They do. He'd thought about this part too. But I think there are people in this valley who might want to share that cost. She turned from the window. Eustace Pell, she said, reading exactly where he was going. And the Brannan family. Both of them are in agreements with Varick that a good attorney would want to look at, according to what I heard in your dining room back in January. He met her eyes. They've been isolated. Dealing with Varick one family at a time, alone. That's how he operates. He needs isolation. If we're connected, the arithmetic changes. She was quiet for a moment. You want me to invite them here? Yes. And tell them that their private financial agreements might be legally questionable. Tell them there's an attorney coming to review the Northwind's water rights situation and that anyone with outstanding agreements involving Varick might want to be present. He paused. Let them decide what to do with that. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, the exposure, the risk, the particular vulnerability of a woman who'd run this property alone for 4 years, asking neighbors for the kind of solidarity that required trust she hadn't necessarily been offered freely before. You think they'll come? She asked. I think Eustace Pell hasn't slept properly in 3 years, Silas said, and I think he's been waiting for someone to tell him there might be a door. She was quiet for another moment. Then she went to her desk and took out a sheet of writing paper. Write the attorney letter, she said. I'll write to Eustace. The attorney arrived before the inspection date with 11 days to spare. His name was Clement Adler, and he was based in Butte, which was far enough from Red Willow Crossing that Varick's reach didn't include him. He was younger than Silas had expected, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the particular energy of a man who'd chosen a profession that required him to care about things and hadn't yet lost the habit. He wore a city suit that had met rural Montana unprepared but wasn't apologizing for it. Eustace Pell came the afternoon Adler arrived. Husbands were dark. The Brannans, a husband and wife who'd sold 2/3 of their range to Varick 3 years ago and retained the rest under a use agreement they clearly didn't fully understand, came the following morning. Most of its windows were dark. They all sat in the Northwind dining room, which Elowen closed to regular guests for the afternoon, and Adler went through the water rights documentation first, because that established what they were dealing with. Eustace Pell's face, as Adler explained the documented superior water right and what it meant for Varick's consolidated operation, went through several stages. The first was confusion, the second was a dawning understanding, and the third was something that landed somewhere between relief and fury, the expression of a man who has just been told that the thing that's been crushing him may have had structural weaknesses all along that he didn't know to look for. He told me the creek rights on the south end of my former property were unregistered, and therefore his to use as he saw fit, Eustace said. He said it quietly, like he was working out the sentence as he said it, checking each word for accuracy. That's why I couldn't access it in the growing months. He said it was his right. Was that in the written agreement? Adler asked. Aye, he said we had a... Eustace stopped. I took his word on the water. Adler wrote something on his notepad. What does the written agreement actually say about the water access? He said it was standard language. Miss Pell, Adler said gently, but without softening the point. Do you have the written agreement with you? Eustace reached into his coat and produced a document that Silas suspected he'd been carrying for 3 years, kept close the way people keep things that scare them. Adler read it without expression, which was the expression of a professional who'd trained himself out of reacting visibly while reading. Then he looked up. The written agreement does not restrict your water access during April through September, he said. The restriction you've been operating under was verbal. The dining room was very quiet, meaning it wasn't legal, Mrs. Brannan said. She said it like she was trying out the words to see if they broke, meaning it was unenforceable, Adler said, which was the more precise answer. Whether Mr. Varick knew that when he stated it verbally is a separate question. What I can tell you is that the written agreement, as it stands, does not include that restriction. Eustace Pell put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a man absorbing something large. Silas looked at the table surface. He'd known what the conversation might produce in an abstract way. Sitting inside the actual moment of it was different. He thought about his own ranch, the 40 minutes in the bankruptcy, preceding the judge, checking his watch, and understood something about the specific weight of being told that things you'd accepted as fixed were not in fact fixed, and what that did to the previous years you'd spent accommodating them. There was relief in that. There was also grief, because relief for what you didn't have to accept going forward didn't give you back the years you'd already spent accepting it. The inspection happened on a Thursday, 12 days after Adler's arrival. The inspector was a territorial assessor named Garrow, a compact, careful man in his 40s who showed up with a notebook and the professional neutrality of someone trying very hard not to be what he'd probably been instructed to be. Silas read him in about 10 minutes. Garrow was not a corrupt man. He was a man who'd been told to look hard at a specific property, and he intended to look hard. And the question was what he found when he did. What he found was this: a newly reshingled north barn, reset corral posts with fresh concrete footings, a documented, professionally surveyed water, right with a clean chain of title going back to 1841. Financial records organized into dated categories, going back 12 years, witnessed and indexed. An irrigation restoration project documented from initial survey to current yield, with photographs Adler had suggested they commission from a man in town who did portrait work but owned a proper camera. A west pasture that was visibly, undeniably recovering. And a property manager who could answer every question about every system on the grounds without hesitation or evasion. Garrow walked the property for 4 hours. He asked questions. Silas answered them. Holt answered the ones about the cattle operation. Elowen answered the ones about the business records. Lydia, at one point, retrieved a specific supply invoice from 1919 that Garrow mentioned he'd want to see, producing it from the newly organized files in under 2 minutes, which caused Garrow to look at her and then at Silas with an expression he didn't entirely contain. At the end of the 4 hours, Garrow stood in the yard with his notebook and wrote something on his final page. He tore it out and handed it to Elowen. It was the inspection results summary, which he was required to provide on site. Elowen read it. Her face did the thing it did when she was processing something significant still gathered, not yet released. She handed it to Silas. No material violations, no required remediation, no basis for operational restriction. Property assessed as maintained and improving. At the bottom, in Garrow's careful handwriting, boundary challenge and water rights claim, noted as concurrent disputes, inspection findings do not support association with operational compliance concerns. In other words, whoever filed this inspection request attached it to the wrong hook. The property was fine. The disputes were somewhere else. Silas handed the paper back to Elowen. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the care of some placing a weapon safely away. Garrow shook hands with everyone, in order of who was standing closest to him, and walked to his horse without additional conversation. He'd done what he was supposed to do and found what there was to find, and he was clearly ready to not be in this county anymore. Holt watched him go. Then he looked at Silas with an expression that was as close to open as Holt's face got. "That's it," he said. "That's the inspection," Silas said. "And the boundary challenge? Still pending. But it's harder to sustain without the inspection findings supporting it. Adler's going to file a response this week that includes Crane's survey and the water rights documentation together." Silas looked at the west pasture. The afternoon light was on it, and the green was genuinely visible now, not a suggestion of recovery, but the fact of it. It doesn't end here. Varick still has options. What options? He can push the boundary challenge through to a hearing regardless. It'll be expensive for him, and he'll lose, but he might do it out of spite. Silas paused. Or he can move to something else. Something we haven't anticipated. Holt was quiet for a moment. "You think he will?" Silas out's dark. Silas thought about Varick, the coat that stayed dry in a blizzard, the voice that didn't lower when it should have, the systematic patience of a man who'd spent 4 years building, something he was very close to completing. Men like that didn't just absorb a setback and recalibrate cleanly. They got personal about it. "I think he's going to be angry," Silas said. "And angry men with money make decisions that aren't always the smart ones." That evening, after dinner, Silas walked the property one more time. It had become a habit, the last circuit of the day, checking things, noticing things, the perimeter walk that helped him think. The light was going long and gold in the west, the way April light in Montana does when it finally decides to commit to itself, and the cottonwoods along the channel were showing the first pale green of their own returning leaves. He stood for a moment at the head gate, the new timber fitting cleanly into the old stone, the water moving through steady and reliable, the sound of it, the particular sound of things working the way they were supposed to work. He thought about the bankruptcy proceedings, the 40 minutes, the judge's pocket watch. He thought about Eustace Pell's face when Adler explained the written agreement. He thought about the morning he'd walked out of the barn in a storm and fixed a fence because accepting warmth without earning it was physically impossible for him. He hadn't fixed things here because he'd planned any of this. He'd fixed things because things needed fixing, and he was present and capable, and the alternative, standing still while a man with money dismantled something worth keeping, was something he no longer had the patience for. What he hadn't fully calculated was what it cost to be present this way, to be this invested in someone else's fight, to have his children's daily lives wound through the rhythms of this place, this property, these people. He hadn't let himself look at that directly yet. It felt like looking at the sun possible, but requiring care about when and for how long. The sound of footsteps on the frozen ground came from behind him. He knew them without turning around. Elowen stopped a few feet away and looked at the same water he'd been looking at. Adler thinks the boundary challenge will be dismissed within 2 months, she said. That's optimistic. He's an optimistic man, I noticed. She was quiet for a moment. Then Eustace Pell asked me tonight, before he left, whether you were planning to stay. Silas said nothing. I told him I didn't know, she said. That seemed like the honest answer. It is. Is it still the honest answer? She asked. Her voice was level, the way it was when she'd decided to say something, and was following through on the decision, regardless of whether it was comfortable. He thought about Tuesday in the 4th stall, about Lydia's careful columns, about Cal explaining the hydraulics of the irrigation channel to a barn cat in terms he'd invented himself, about the west pasture with its uneven, real, unhurried green coming back. I don't know, he said. And that was honest too, but it was a different kind of not knowing than it had been in January, standing in the storm with nothing in his pockets. This not knowing had weight to it. It had content. It was the not knowing of a man standing in a place that had started to feel like something, trying to decide if what it felt like was something he was allowed to trust. The water ran through the old channel in the evening light. The cottonwoods held their first spring leaves above it. And across the valley, in whatever room Gideon Varick occupied that night, a man who had built his empire on other people's isolation was discovering that something had changed in Red Willow Crossing, something he hadn't planned for and couldn't buy his way around. Not yet, anyway. He still had moves to make. Varick's next move came from a direction nobody had been watching. That was the thing about him he didn't repeat himself. Each approach came from a different angle, which meant defending against the last one didn't protect you from the next. It was the quality that had made him successful for so long in this valley, and it was the quality that made Silas most uneasy in the weeks following the inspection. He knew something was coming. He didn't know what shape it would take. It took the shape of a rumor, not a dramatic rumor, not an accusation of anything criminal or scandalous. Something quieter and more corrosive than that. The rumor which moved through Red Willow, crossing the way these things always move, without a clear source, and with the self-replicating quality of something that feels plausible even when it isn't. Was this? Silas Mercer had worked his way into the Northwind House, the way certain men worked their way into situations involving widows with property. That the repair work and the irrigation project, the positioning as a trusted employee, were all part of a calculated strategy to get his name attached to land that wasn't his. That the children were deployed as a sympathetic front. That Elowen Hartwell, who was a capable woman, but had been managing alone for a long time, couldn't be blamed for not seeing it. These men were skilled at what they did. Silas heard it first from Creddy, who told him with the directness of a man who'd decided honesty was more useful than tact. They were in the barn. It had become the place where people told Silas things. And Creddy leaned against a stall post and reported it the way you'd report weather coming in, not to alarm, but because knowing was better than not knowing. Heard it twice in the last 3 days, Kretzy said. Different people, almost the same words. That's not coincidence. No, Silas agreed. It's not. You know where it's coming from. I know. Creddy looked at him steadily. He was a straightforward man, not complicated, not interested in complications, but possessed of the particular moral clarity that sometimes comes from a life lived simply and honestly. What are you going to do about it? Silas thought about several options. The direct approach, finding Varric and confronting him, would accomplish nothing except give Varric the satisfaction of knowing the rumor had landed. Demanding corrections from people who'd repeated it would make him look defensive and guilty-seeming, which was exactly the intended effect. Ignoring it was also dangerous, because rumors that weren't addressed had a way of becoming accepted as uncontested. Tell people the truth when they bring it up, Silas said. Don't go looking for conversations about it, but don't sidestep it either. Creddy nodded slowly. And Mrs. Hartwell? She needs to hear it before someone tells her in a way that's designed to hurt. You going to tell her? Today. He found her in the kitchen garden, which she'd been working on, since the ground softened not a large garden, but the careful, purposeful kind that tells you something about a person. She was on her knees turning soil with a hand fork, which she didn't stop doing when he came up. There's a rumor going around about me, he said. No preamble. I want you to hear it from me. She stopped working, looked up at him. He told her what Creddy had said. All of it directly, in the same flat recounting voice he'd have used to describe a fence problem. He didn't soften it, and he didn't elaborate on it. He gave her the information and let her process it without performance. She listened. When he finished, she looked down at the dirt on her gloves for a moment. How long has this been moving? She asked. 3 days that I know of. Probably longer. And you think it's Varric. Same words, different people, no single source. That's a coordinated thing. He's got at least one person in town whose job is to start conversations in the right places. She pulled off one glove and then the other. Methodical. What do you want me to do? Nothing, he said. I'm not telling you this because I need you to defend me. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's being said about your property and your judgment. And because if someone brings it to you in a way designed to put doubt in your mind about me, you should have already heard the plain version. She looked at him. The morning light was on her face, and she looked tired in the way she'd been looking tired since the inspection not defeated, just running on a shorter reserve than she was letting on to anyone. Is any of it true? She asked. Not as an accusation. As a genuine question, asked in the same direct way she asked everything. He held her gaze. I came through your door in a blizzard with nothing, and needed help. You gave it. I worked because I can't accept something without giving something back. And somewhere in the last 4 months I've become, he stopped, found the word that was honest, and no larger than honest. Invested. In this place, in what we're trying to do here in another stop. That's the honest account. That's not what they're saying. No, it's not. She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she put her gloves back on. I've been managing this property alone for 4 years, she said. Every decision, every mistake, every season. I don't think I've confused a competent man with a trustworthy one. I've dealt with enough competent men who weren't trustworthy to know the difference. She picked up the hand fork again. And I don't think what you just told me is the account of a man running a scheme. All right, he said. But I want to say something. She was still looking at the garden, not at him. If there comes a moment when what you want from this situation becomes something that isn't what it is now, I'd rather you tell me plainly than maneuver. Whatever else I can say about Varric, he taught me what it feels like to be maneuvered by someone who smiles while they do it. It landed exactly as heavily as it was meant to. He took it without flinching. That's fair, he said. Good. She turned the fork in the soil. Now tell Adler about the rumor. He'll want to know for the boundary challenge response. He hadn't thought of that angle. It was a better strategic instinct than his own in this particular moment, which was either a sign that she thought faster than him in certain situations, or that she was less rattled by it than he was, or both. He went and told Adler. The attorney listened with the focused attention he gave everything, asked 2 clarifying questions, and wrote something in his notebook. Reputational pressure as a parallel strategy to the legal challenges, he said. Classic. Makes the target's position emotionally exhausting, independent of the legal merits. He looked up. It also tells us something. What? He's worried about the legal merits, Adler said. Men who are confident in their legal position don't usually run parallel reputational operations. It costs money, and it carries its own risks. You run this kind of thing when you need to create enough doubt and fatigue to force a settlement before the legal questions are resolved. He thinks he's going to lose the boundary challenge. He's starting to think so. Crane's survey and your water rights documentation together make it very difficult to sustain. Adler closed his notebook. Which is the good news? What's the bad news? The bad news is that losing a legal challenge doesn't end things for a man like Varric. It just tells him which tools don't work. He'll look for a different one. Silas thought about that for the next several days while he worked, which was how he thought best. Most of its windows were dark. He turned the problem around in his mind the way you turn a bad fence line, looking at it from each angle, checking where the weak points were, figuring out what needed to be done before the next storm. What he kept coming back to was something he'd understood abstractly at the beginning, and was now understanding with more depth. Varric's entire operation was built on isolation. Every purchase, every agreement, every piece of the empire he'd assembled had been done one family at a time, in private, with each family believing they were dealing with circumstances unique to their own situation. The Pells didn't know what the Brannons had agreed to. The Brannons didn't know what the third family, the Houghtons, who'd sold outright 3 years ago and moved on, had been told when they sold. Nobody compared notes, because nobody had a reason to sit in the same room together and do it. Until the dining room meeting with Adler. That meeting had been practical, focused on the water rights, this inspection, the immediate legal questions. But it has also been, without being designed as such, the first time people in this valley had sat together in the same room and compared what they knew about Varric's methods. Silas thought about that for 2 days. Then he went to Elowen with an idea that was either going to sound reasonable or completely unworkable, and he wasn't entirely sure which. The inn buys supplies from outside the valley, he said. They were in the office, which was where they'd started having their actual conversations, the ones that weren't about immediate maintenance problems. Flour, dairy grain, most of the produce. It goes through a supplier in town who buys from wherever's cheapest. Yes, she said, waiting. What if it didn't? She looked at him. You want to buy local. The Pells have a dairy operation that's underperforming because Varric's water restriction, the illegal one, meant they couldn't properly irrigate their feed pasture during summer. Now that Adler's pointed out, the restriction wasn't in the written agreement, they can actually run the dairy properly. He leaned forward slightly. The Brannons have grain. They've been selling below market because Varric controls the primary buyer relationship in this county. He's got an arrangement with the main grain merchant that effectively caps what the Brannons can get for their crop. You want to buy from them directly. I want to build direct purchasing relationships with every family in this valley that Varric has been economically pressuring. Not out of charity, he said it quickly, because Elowen's expression was already moving toward the practical of objections. Because it's better for us operationally. Direct purchasing means we negotiate price without a middleman margin. We get fresher product, shorter supply lines, and relationships with producers who have reason to give us their best. She was quiet, working through it. He could see her doing the same thing. Lydia did, running the columns in her head. It also, she said slowly, makes the inn economically connected to every family that Varric's been trying to isolate. Yes. Which means those families have a reason to see Northwind House succeed. And we have a reason to see them succeed. And Varric has to damage all of us to damage any of us, which is a much harder calculation than picking off one family at a time. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something he didn't expect. She almost smiled. Not a full smile, just the corner of it. The one that happened when she found something genuinely good in an idea and didn't want to oversell it before she'd thought it through. You thought about this for a while, she said. A few days. How does the transition work?
We can't just cancel our current supplier contracts overnight.
No, but most of them are quarterly. We don't renew the ones we're replacing. Give suppliers 30 days notice, which is professional and doesn't burn anything we might need later. He'd thought through the sequence. Start with dairy. The Pells are the easiest to bring in. Their product is good and they're close. Grain next, because the Brannon deal is straightforward if we're buying direct. Eggs and produce after that. There are 2 families on the East Road who've been selling through Varric's feed store middleman. Elowen picked up her pen. Write the names down for me. All of them. He wrote the list. She looked at it. She wrote numbers next to each name, estimated weekly or monthly purchase volumes, the kind of arithmetic she did in her head constantly. He watched her work. This is going to take 3 months to fully transition, she said. More or less. And Varrick's going to notice. He's going to notice fast. He'll lose the middleman revenue first, and then he'll start seeing that the families he's been pressuring are financially more stable than they were. Silas met her eyes. He won't like it. He's already not liking things. She set the pen down. Do we need to worry about him interfering with our supplier relationships? Approaching the Pells, for example, and making things difficult? Maybe. But Eustace Pell has already been in a room with an attorney and heard the words verbal restriction, unenforceable. That changes a man's posture. He paused. I'd like to talk to him directly. Explain what we're building. Give him the choice clearly. You want to go see him. This week, if you can spare the time from the property. She thought about it. Take Holt with you. He hadn't expected that. Holt? Holt has managed cattle in this valley for 11 years. Eustace Pell respects that. You're still the man from the blizzard to most people here. That's not an insult. It's just geography. She looked at him. Take Holt. It'll land differently. She was right, which was something he was finding more and more to be the case about Elowen Hartwell's practical judgments. She had a specific kind of intelligence about people, not manipulation, not performance, but a genuine reading of what made things land differently with different people, built from years of running a business where reading the room was survival. He went to Holt. Holt's response to the supply chain proposal was the same response he gave most of Silas's ideas: a long pause, a specific look at the middle distance, and then a question that went directly to the practical center of whatever the idea was. You think the Pell's dairy is actually up to consistency? He asked. Because buying local is only good business if the product's reliable. I've talked to Creddy about their operation. He says the dairy's been inconsistent because of the water restriction on their feed pasture, not because of poor management. Fix the water. You fix the consistency. You're betting a supply chain on a water dispute resolution. The restriction wasn't in the written agreement. Adler's already sent a letter to Varrick's attorney making that clear. Holt was quiet for a moment, and if Varrick makes noise anyway, tries to pressure the Pells into backing out of a deal with us, then we know more about what Varrick's willing to do in writing, which is information Adler will find useful. Holt looked at him with the expression that had replaced the hostile suspicion of the early days. Something more like the way you look at someone whose particular way of thinking you've come to accept even when you don't entirely understand it. You want things to go sideways, he said. You need it to go sideways so you can see where the pressure points are. I need to understand the full shape of what he's built, Silas said. The only way to see all of it is to push on the edges and watch what moves. That's a dangerous way to run a property. We're already in danger. I'd rather understand the shape of it. Holt touched his mustache, looked at the middle distance. When do we go see Eustace? They rode out Thursday morning, Silas and Holt, on a day that had finally committed to spring in a way that wasn't taking it back real warmth in the afternoon sun, mud in the low spots of the road, the kind of morning that reminded you winter had been a condition rather than a permanent state. Eustace Pell met them in his yard. He was a rangy man, in his 60s, weathered in the specific way of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors and never fully come in. He shook Holt's hand first, and then Silas's, and the order of that told Silas that Elowen had been right about bringing Holt, which he filed away. They sat on the porch, and Silas explained the purchasing proposal plainly. Direct contract, set volume, fair market price, quarterly review. The Northwind would commit to a 12-month initial term. Payment delivery, no credit extended, which was a protection for the Pells as much as anyone. Eustace listened without interrupting, which was his way. He asked if its windows were... He asked when Silas finished about volume, about delivery logistics, about what happened if the dairy had a bad month. All three were the right questions, which told Silas that Eustace was a better businessman than 3 years. Under Varrick's thumb had made him look. And you think Adler's letter settles the water access? Eustace asked. I think Varrick's attorney knows the restriction wasn't in the written agreement, and that pursuing it now creates a discoverable record of him enforcing something he knew was unenforceable, Silas said, which is the kind of thing attorneys don't enjoy explaining to judges. Eustace was quiet for a moment. He's going to be angry about this, he said. Not a question. He's already angry, Holt said. It was the first time he'd spoken since the pleasantries, and Eustace looked at him with the attention you give a man who speaks infrequently. Angry doesn't change what's written down. And what's written down says your water's your water. Eustace looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who'd worked hard for a long time and had spent 3 years feeling like the working was somehow still not enough, which was its own kind of exhaustion. My wife's been telling me for 2 years that we should have gotten an attorney when we signed, he said. I told her the terms were straightforward and I could read a contract. Nobody said anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. She was right, Eustace said, anyway. He stood up. Bring me the contract terms in writing. I'll have my wife look at them. If she says yes, we'll sign. He did not say anything more about Varick. He didn't need to. The Brannons were a different conversation, shorter, more cautious, with the particular wariness of people who'd been through something and weren't sure they were fully through it yet. Mrs. Brannon did most of the talking, which surprised Silas until he understood that she was the one who'd managed the books during the Varick agreement period and carried the specific knowledge of what had been signed and what it had cost them. She asked harder questions than Eustace had. She asked about what happened if Northwind House failed, what obligation remained, what the exit terms were, whether the contract was filed with the county, so there was a public record. Silas answered each one carefully and honestly, including the one where the honest answer was, I don't know yet. That's something we'd need Adler to draft properly. She appreciated that he didn't pretend. He could see it in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. They agreed to have Adler send the draft terms to both families within the week. Silas and Holt rode back to Northwind House in the afternoon. They didn't talk much on the ride back, which was normal for them. But somewhere around the last mile, Holt said, without looking at Silas directly, you know what this starts to look like. What does it look like? A community, Holt said. Like the word surprised him slightly coming out. It starts to look like something that holds together instead of each piece standing alone. That's the point, Silas said. I know it's the point. I'm saying it's working. He paused. That doesn't happen fast. Usually. Nothing about this has been particularly fast. 4 months, Holt said. You fixed a fence in a blizzard 4 months ago, and now there's water in the west pasture and 2 families who might be able to stay on their land. He rode for another moment. That's not nothing. Silas thought about several things he could say. He settled on we haven't won yet. I know we haven't won yet. Holt's jaw worked briefly. I'm saying it's not nothing. That's all. The contracts went to Adler, who dropped at them carefully and sent copies to both families by the end of the following week. The Pells signed within 3 days. Mrs. Brannon sat on the grain contract for a full week, then sent back 2 requested amendments, both reasonable. Both things Adler said they should accept and signed the amended version. Silas told Elowen when the second contract came in. She was at the front counter, doing the evening reconciliation, when he put the signed document on the counter in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked up at him. Both of them. Both. She picked up the contract. Read through it even though she'd seen the draft. Adler says the grain terms are favorable, she said. They are. And the dairy? Creddy says the Pells pasture is already responding to the proper water access. He thinks their summer yield will be back to where it was before Varick's restriction. Maybe better. She set the contract down. We need to talk about the inn's purchasing budget, she said. If we're transitioning 4 suppliers over 3 months, I need to know the cash flow implications week by week. Lydia's already started the projections. Elowen looked at him. She asked about the supplier contracts 2 days ago, Silas said. I told her what we were doing. She said she'd run the week-by-week numbers. Elowen was quiet for a moment. She's 10, she said, but it was different from the other times. She'd said it not a protest. More like someone checking their own understanding of something that kept defying expectation. She's almost 11, Silas said. Elowen's mouth did the corner thing. Go get the projections, she said. Let's see what she has. What Lydia had was 16 weeks of projected cash flow laid out in her small, careful columns, with conservative and optimistic estimates in separate columns, and a note at the bottom that said, I assume the Pells need 6 weeks to reach full yield consistency. If it's sooner, the number in column C goes up. If it's longer, we should talk to Adler about adjusting the payment schedule. Elowen read it twice, Then she set it on the counter next to the signed contracts and looked at the wall for a moment. She should be paid more, Elowen said. She'll tell you she's doing it, because it's interesting, Silas said. I know. Pay her more. Anyway. Varick's response to the new supplier arrangements came through two channels simultaneously, which was either coincidence or the sign of someone who'd been watching closely and chose his moment. The first channel was another rumor, this one, specifically targeting Eustace Pell, suggesting that the dairy contract with Northwind was financially unsound and that Pell was taking on risk he didn't understand. The second was a visit from one of Varick's men to the Brannan property, offering to buy their remaining acreage at a price that was and this was deliberate. Silas was certain exactly double what Varick had offered the year before. The timing was meant to look like generosity. It was actually a test to see whether the new contracts had changed the Brannans' calculus. Mrs. Brannan turned down the offer before her husband finished reading it. She sent Adler a letter describing the visit the same day, which Adler received alongside a separate letter Silas had written describing the new rumor about Pell's finances. Adler wrote back within the week. His letter was addressed to Elowen, but it was clearly meant to be shared. The pattern now documented, Adler wrote, across the rumor campaigns, the boundary challenge, the inspection request, and the purchasing pressure constitutes a course of conduct that a territorial court would likely find relevant to the question of whether the original lease and sale agreements entered into by neighboring landowners were made under conditions of material misrepresentation. This is a different kind of legal question than the property disputes. It is potentially a more serious one. Silas read that paragraph 3 times. He brought it to Elowen. She read it and then looked up at him with the expression that meant she was deciding something. He's saying Varick's pattern of conduct could be used to challenge the Pell and Brannan agreements, she said. More than that. He's saying the documented pattern, the rumors, the fake inspection, the boundary challenge is evidence of the same way he operated when he made those deals. If you can show a court that this is how he does business, it changes the story on what happened to Eustace Pell's water access. She was quiet for a long moment. That's a much bigger fight than we started with. Yes, that's not just protecting Northwind House. That's challenging what he's built in this entire valley. Yes, Silas said again. She looked at the letter. Adler's suggesting it. But this has to be the Pells and Brannan's decision, not ours. Completely. We can't push them toward a fight they don't choose. What we can do is make sure they understand what they might have standing to pursue. He paused. And we can make sure they know they wouldn't be alone in it. She stood up from the desk, went to the window. The west pasture was in full view, and the green now was unambiguous, not recovering, not suggesting recovery, but genuinely there, thick in the places the water reached first, and coming in behind in the rest. It was the most dramatic change Silas had seen in a piece of land in his adult life, and he'd seen a lot of changed land. Call them back, she said, all of them, here in the dining room, and invite Adler to present what he's found. Silas looked at her. You're sure? She turned from the window. I've been alone in this fight for 4 years without knowing I was in a fight, she said. I'm done doing this one family at a time. The meeting happened on a Saturday evening with the dining room closed again and a fire in the hearth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with it being a cold May night in Montana. The Pells came together, Eustace and his wife Clara, who turned out to have sharp eyes and a sharper tongue than her husband, and who Silas decided immediately was the person in that marriage he most needed on the same side. The Brannans came, both of them, with the careful posture of people who've been in one too many rooms where bad news was delivered and have learned to brace. Holt was there. Lydia sat in the corner. Elowen had suggested it, partly because Lydia had prepared an updated financial summary, and partly, Silas suspected, because Elowen had started thinking about Lydia's presence as useful in a way she didn't entirely explain yet. Adler stood at the head of the room and presented what he had without theater. The documented water rights, the boundary challenge and its likely failure, the inspection findings, the contracts now in place, and then carefully giving them the information and giving them space to receive it, the course of conduct argument, what it meant, what it would require, what it might accomplish if pursued. Clara Pell asked the first question. How long? To file and pursue a territorial challenge on the agreements. 18 months minimum, possibly 2 years. Cost? Shared across multiple families, manageable. Alone? Difficult. Clara looked at her husband. Something passed between them, not a whole conversation, just the compressed version that married people who've been through things together can conduct in 3 seconds. Then she looked at Adler. What do we need to do first? Adler told her. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no speech, no rallying cry, no moment of unified declaration. Clara Pell just asked a practical question and got a practical answer, and the room's atmosphere shifted the way rooms shift when a decision that's been hanging in the air finally comes down. Silas sat in the corner and watched it happen and felt something that wasn't quite triumph. It was more like the satisfaction of watching something that was put together correctly finally bear the weight it was built for. The weeks that followed were busy in a way that was different from the earlier kind of busy. The earlier work had been reactive, fixing what was broken, responding to what Varick threw at them. This was different. This was building. The supplier contracts were running. The West Pasture was producing. The dining room was filling on evenings, when it used to have 4 tables occupied. Word moved through the valley, the way Varick's rumors had moved, but this time the word was different. Something was different at Northwind House. Something was different about how several of the valley families were operating, and different in a small place attracted attention. A family named Aldridge, who'd been quietly watching from the East Road for the past 2 months, sent a note asking whether the Northwind was interested in purchasing eggs and summer produce. Silas took the note to Elowen. She wrote back that afternoon. Cal, who had been the most unchanged person in the household through all of its 6-year-olds having a magnificent imperviousness to abstract economic conflicts, had by this point formed a working partnership with Drum that consisted primarily of Cal, asking questions and Drum answering them in the minimum possible words, which turned out to be a communication style that suited both of them perfectly. He was learning carpentry, or the beginning of it. He was learning it the way he learned everything, through endless specific questions and the particular physical memory of a child whose hands understood things his brain hadn't caught up to yet. Holt had started teaching him horsework properly, not just allowing him around the barn, but actual instruction how to approach, how to read an ear position, how to move. Cal absorbed it with a seriousness that made Holt's weather-beaten face do something soft around the edges. He thought nobody was watching. Silas watched anyway. It was another habit he couldn't break. The boundary challenge dismissal came in writing on a Wednesday morning in late May, a formal notification from the Territorial Land Office that the challenge had been found to lack sufficient merit for a full hearing, given the competing professional survey and the documented historical evidence supporting the existing boundary. The challenge was dismissed without prejudice, which meant Varick could theoretically try again with new evidence, but the window for doing so was narrow and the cost of doing it had just gone up considerably. Elowen held the notification in both hands and read it standing at the front counter, which was where the mail came in. Silas was passing through and she held it out to him without a word. He read it and gave it back. Adler will need a copy, he said. I'll send it today. She set it on the counter. 1 down. 1 down. She looked at him with the particular expression she'd developed over the past months, not a new expression exactly, but one that had been there in pieces from early on and had assembled itself into something more coherent over time. It was the expression of a person who had stopped being surprised by him and hadn't yet decided what to do about that. Silas, she said yes. She seemed to consider several things. Then Cal asked me yesterday if this was home now. He went still. I told him I didn't know what you'd said about it, she said. And he said, and I'm telling you this exactly, he said, Papa doesn't say things until he's sure. But I think he's pretty sure. The front counter of the Northwind House Inn was not the place he'd have chosen for this conversation. Most of its windows were dark. The morning sun was coming in the window at the wrong angle, and there were chores he'd planned for the next 2 hours, and this was not the moment he'd worked out. I don't have anything to offer, he said. It came out more strained than he intended. I have wages from this job and a horse and 2 children. That's what I have. I know what you have, she said. I also know what you've done with what you have. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to make a declaration in the lobby. I'm telling you what Cal said. He looked at her for a long moment. He's right, Silas said. That I'm pretty sure. She nodded. Once. With the settled quality she brought to decisions. Then we'll figure out the rest, she said, practically, like everything else. She picked up the dismissal notification and went to the office. Silas stood at the front counter for a moment, aware of something having shifted that was not going to unshift, which was uncomfortable and right simultaneously. Then he went out to do the chores he'd planned. The two families' legal challenge against Varick's agreements was filed by Adler at the territorial court in the second week of June. It was filed in the names of Eustace and Clara Pell and the Brannan family, with Northwind House named as a supporting interested party in the related water rights documentation. Adler had constructed it carefully, using everything he'd documented: the course of conduct argument, the verbal water restriction that wasn't in the written agreement, the systematic pattern across multiple properties. It was a serious filing. The territorial court assigned it a docket number and scheduled a preliminary hearing for October. When word reached Varick and reached within 2 days, because word always reached people like Varick, quickly his response was the most direct thing he'd done since the blizzard night when he'd stood in the lobby of Northwind House and told Elowen to count her silverware. He came himself. He rode up to the front of the Northwind on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 men behind him and got down from his horse and came through the front door, and the room went quiet the same way it had gone quiet on that winter night 4 months ago in a spreading wave and ending with only the fire. Silas was coming through from the back hallway when he heard the door. He stopped. Varick looked at him across the room. The expensive coat, the dry boots. It wasn't raining today. The face of a man who had made a calculation and arrived somewhere that was past strategy and into something more personal. "I'd like to speak with you," Varick said. He was addressing Silas, not Elowen. That was different from before. "All right," Silas said. He didn't move from where he was standing. "Speak." Varick looked at the people in the room. 2 ranch hands at a table, Bess visible in the kitchen doorway, Holt coming in from outside behind Varick and stopping when he read the room. Varick clearly wanted a private concession. He was also clearly calculating whether demanding one would make him look weaker than having it in public. "You've made this complicated," Varick said. "You filed a fraudulent boundary challenge and a manufacturer inspection request," Silas said. His voice was even. Not aggressive, not heated. Informational. "I'd say you made it complicated. You had nothing when you walked through that door. Nothing." He said it like the original insult was still the relevant fact, like everything that had happened since was an anomaly that hadn't updated his original assessment. "You had 43 cents and a tired horse, and you've decided to use my generosity in tolerating your presence here as a platform to dismantle what I've built." "I didn't use your generosity," Silas said. "You didn't offer me any. I used Mrs. Hartwell's." Varick's jaw tightened. "I'm prepared to make a settlement offer, a serious one. The litigation goes away. I drop the boundary challenge appeal I'm considering. And you." "There's no appeal," Silas said. "The dismissal was without prejudice, which means you can file new evidence, not file the same challenge again. And you don't have new evidence because the boundary's correct." Varick paused slightly. He hadn't expected that level of technical specificity, which told Silas that Varick had expected this conversation to go differently, had expected a man with 43 cents in his pocket to be more susceptible to the sound of authority. "What do you want?" Varick asked. It was a genuinely curious question, and it was the most honest thing Silas had heard from him. Silas thought about it for a moment. "Nothing from you," he said. "The Pells want their water access restored in writing. The Brannans want their use agreement amended to reflect what they were actually told they were signing. The territorial court's going to sort out what they're owed beyond that." He paused. "And I want you to stop sending men to neighborhoods where families are having quiet conversations. That's it." Varick looked at him for a long moment. The room was very still. "You walked in here with nothing," Varick said again, quieter this time. Not as an insult now. More like he was still trying to understand it. "I know," Silas said. "And I've been doing this work ever since." Varick held his gaze for another moment. Then he turned, and the 2 men behind him turned, and they went back through the door and onto their horses and rode out of Red Willow Crossing without another word. Holt let the door swing shut behind them. He stood there for a moment. Then he looked at Silas with the expression that had replaced all the earlier ones, not admiration exactly, not even full understanding, but the particular look of a man who has seen something and is revising an assumption he didn't know he'd been carrying. He's not done, Holt said. No, Silas agreed. But he's different now. Different how? Silas thought about the conversation. Varick's face when Silas had mentioned the appeal limitations. The slight recalibration, the shift in the room's gravity. He came here to make a deal, Silas said. Men who think they're winning don't come to make deals. Bess had retreated to the kitchen at some point during the exchange, and now she appeared in the doorway with a dish towel in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had decided that what had just happened deserved some kind of acknowledgement, but couldn't quite settle on the form. Coffee, she said. Silas looked at her. Please, he said. He sat down at the nearest table, and Holt sat across from him, and Bess brought coffee for both of them, and the two its ranch hands at the other table went back to their own conversation, and the fire crackled the way it had on Cormorant night 4 months ago when a penniless man walked through that door with 2 cold children and a saddlebag containing everything he owned. It was the same room, the same fire, the same counter. Almost everything else was different. Varick didn't come back. That was the first thing, the silence, after the door closed behind him, which stretched from that Tuesday afternoon into the following week, and then the week after, and the absence of him was almost louder than his presence had been. Silas expected something. A new legal filing, another rumor, a different kind of pressure from a different angle. He kept waiting for the next move, and the next move didn't come. And after 3 weeks of that particular silence, he started to understand that Varick's visit had been the thing he said. It wasn't a man reading the room and discovering the arithmetic no longer worked in his favor. That didn't mean he'd conceded anything. Men like Varick didn't concede. They recalculated. But the recalculation was going to take time, and time for the first time since January was something Northwind House had. Adler wrote in July with a progress report on the territorial filing. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled and then rescheduled to November, which Adler said was normal and not concerning. The Pell's attorney Adler had connected them with a colleague in Butte, had sent a formal letter to Varick's representative regarding the water access restriction, and Varick's representative had responded with language that was notably less aggressive than his earlier communications. Not concession, but the temperature had dropped. He's talking to his own lawyers, Adler wrote, in the careful phrasing of a man who didn't want to oversell a development. Men in his position talk to their lawyers when they're considering the cost of continuing versus the cost of settling. This does not guarantee settlement. It means the conversation has started internally. Elowen read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Silas without comment. He read it and passed it back. What do you think, she asked. I think Adler's being professionally cautious. Which is right. He considered it. Varick felt something for 4 years. He's not going to watch it come apart in a single hearing if there's a way around it. He'll look for what he can protect. Can he protect anything legally? Some of it. The outright purchases the land he actually bought and paid for those are his. The Houghton property, the strip at the ridge, courts aren't going to unwind a clean sale. He thought it through. What he can't protect is the agreements that misrepresented material terms. The Pell's water access. The Brannon's use restrictions. The pattern Adler documented. He paused. If I'm sitting across from his lawyers, I'm telling him to settle the Pell and Brannon claims, release the restrictive provisions, and walk away with the land he legitimately owns. And the water right? That was never his. He knew that before the first offer. Silas held her gaze. That one he doesn't get. She nodded slowly. Then we wait for November. We wait for November. What they did while they waited was work the kind of work that was, after everything, what they were both made for. The West pasture through the summer months became something that stopped people on the road. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet insistence of land that had simply been given what it needed. The grass came in thick across the lower 40, thinner on the upper slope, where the grade made even distribution harder, but present, real. The kind of pasture that could carry cattle through a season without supplemental feeding, which hadn't been true of that land in anyone in Red Willow Crossing's current memory. Holt, who had spent his entire career reading land and cattle together, walked the recovered pasture one morning in August and came back to the barn where Silas was working and stood in the doorway in the particular posture he used when he had something to say. and was deciding how to say it. You could run 20 head on that south section by fall, he said. I know. Mrs. Hartwell know? She will tonight. Holt looked at the middle distance for a moment. That's going to change the numbers. That's the point. I know it's the point. Another pause. I'm saying it out loud because he stopped, started again. When I told Varick's man no last spring, I didn't know what I was saying yes to instead. I just knew I wasn't selling 11 years to someone who'd spent 4 minutes in this valley. He looked at Silas directly. I know what I said yes to now. And I'm telling you, the pasture numbers are going to change things because it seems like the kind of thing you say out loud when it's happening. Silas looked at him. Holt wasn't a man who gave ground easily on anything, and acknowledgement was a form of ground. Thank you, Holt. Don't make a thing of it, Holt said, and went back to his work. Elowen's response to the pasture news was practical, which was entirely consistent with who she was. She asked about fencing requirements, cattle acquisition costs, winter feed logistics, and projected revenue on a 20-head operation in the first year. Silas answered each question. Lydia, who had been present because she was always present when operational discussions happened, had already roughed out a first-year projection on a separate sheet. Elowen looked at Lydia's numbers for a long time. These assume we're purchasing cattle at current market, she said. Current market in Butte, Lydia said. I thought local might be cheaper. Local is cheaper, Elowen confirmed, by about 12% in a normal year. She looked at the projection. Run it at local market and show me both scenarios. Lydia took the sheet back and revised it at the table in about 10 minutes. She worked with the focused silence of someone who found arithmetic genuinely satisfying rather than onerous, which was a quality Silas had recognized in her since she was very small. Margaret used to say that Lydia had been born with her ledger already open. He thought about Margaret more than he showed and less than he used to. That ratio had shifted gradually over the months at Northwind House, in a way he'd noticed without engineering. The grief hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there when he looked at Lydia's eyes, or when Cal said something with a particular inflection that was pure Margaret, but it had stopped being the first thing. Most of it had settled into the appropriate place that grief goes when you've made enough new decisions to have a future running alongside the past. He wasn't sure when that had happened exactly. He was sure it had something to do with the choice to fix a fence in a blizzard rather than sit with his thoughts. Cal turned 7 in August, which was marked by Bess producing a cake that Cal had specified in considerable detail over the preceding 2 weeks. It was lopsided, and the frosting had been applied with more enthusiasm than precision, and Cal declared it the best thing he'd ever eaten with the unambiguous authority of a child who hasn't yet learned to be diplomatic about food. Eustace and Clara Pell came, and the Brannan family, and Creddy and Drum, and the evening turned into something that nobody had formally called a celebration, but that was clearly one. Silas sat at the end of the long table and watched the room and thought about the winter night when he'd sat in this same dining room, with his children eating stew that cost more than he had, wondering whether tomorrow would end the same way the last several months had ended. Clara Pell appeared next to him with a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair beside him with the directness she brought to everything. You're thinking, she said. I do that sometimes. Eustace does the same thing at parties. Sits in the corner and looks at people like he's trying to figure out how they work. She looked at him with the bright, assessing eyes that had become familiar over the past months. You're not from here, and you didn't plan to be here. Does that bother you? He thought about it honestly.
Yeah.
It used to. When everything that happened felt like it was happening to me instead of because of me. He paused. Doesn't bother me the same way now. Because you did something with it. Something like that. Clara looked at the room, her husband laughing at something. Holt said, Cal, the guy explaining to the youngest Janet child, the structural principles of a birdhouse drum had helped him build. Elowen standing by the window talking with Mrs. Brannan with the ease of 2 women who'd found each other useful and were discovering they also liked each other. You know what this is? Clara said. This room right now? What is it? It's what should have been here for the last 4 years, she said. Not bitterly practically, the way Clarissa said everything. We were all right here the whole time, not half a mile from each other, and we were all fighting our own version of the same fight alone. She looked at her coffee. He counted on that. He knew it. He did. One man shouldn't be able to do that to an entire valley. No, Silas agreed. He shouldn't. So don't let it happen again after this is settled. She looked at him directly. That's what I'm saying. Don't let it go back to each family in their own corner once the legal piece is done. He held her gaze. It won't, he said. Not if the purchasing contracts are maintained. Not if people keep sitting in the same room. Make sure they do, she said. The sitting in the same room part. That's what he couldn't stand. She stood up, refilled her coffee from the pot on the sideboard, and went back to her husband. Silas sat for a moment longer with what she'd said, turning it over. It was the clearest articulation he'd heard of what they'd actually been doing, not just protecting property, not just untangling legal agreements, but rebuilding the specific kind of connection that made isolation impossible. Varick's whole architecture had depended on people not knowing what their neighbors knew. The rooms where they'd sat together, the dining room meetings, the contract conversations, the evening with Adler, those rooms were the thing, not the documents that came out of them, the rooms themselves. He'd need to remember that. When this was settled, when the legal pieces were in place and the daily pressure of Varick's campaign was behind them, the instinct would be to go back to working the land and let the community piece take care of itself. He'd seen that happen in other places. People pulling together under pressure and then gradually them pulling apart once the pressure eased, forgetting what the togetherness had made possible. Clara was right. You had to keep the rooms going. October came in hard early frost, the kind that caught people still moving cattle down from summer range and turned the mud on the roads to something between concrete and ice by 6 a.m. Silas pushed the cattle acquisition decision to spring, which was the right call given the pasture's first winter with restored water and the need to understand its performance in cold before putting animals on it. The Northwind's finances were steadier than they'd been at any point. Elowen could clearly remember the supplier contracts had reduced costs. The fuller dining room had increased revenue, and the west pasture, even without cattle, had changed the property assessment value in a way that affected the bank's posture on the operating line. Lydia updated the projections quarterly now. She had moved from rough columns to properly formatted ledger pages, which she'd learned from spending time with the original Hartwell records. In a way that was partly work, and partly, Silas suspected, a form of conversation with the history of the place. The November hearing was held in the territorial courthouse in Helena, which meant Adler going up with the Pell and Brannan family representatives and a box of documentation that Silas and Lydia had spent 2 weeks organizing. Most of its windows were dark. Elowen didn't go, someone had to run the inn, and she and Silas had agreed that Adler and the families were the right people in that room, not the Northwind management. This was the Pell's fight and the Brannans' fight. Northwind had supported it, and the supporting was done. Adler sent a telegram the evening of the second day. Preliminary findings favor plaintiffs on water access restriction. Court agreed pattern of conduct relevant to material misrepresentation question. Varick's counsel requested 30-day settlement discussion period. Agreed. Will write fully. Adler Silas read the telegram at the front counter and then walked to the office and read it again. Most of its windows were dark. Then he found Elowen in the kitchen garden, where she'd been turning over goods for winter, and read it to her. He listened, looked at the turned-over ground. Settlement discussions, she said. 30 days. Which means Varick's lawyers looked at the preliminary findings and told him the same thing I would have told him 6 months ago. That he's going to lose the pattern of conduct argument. That he's going to lose it badly. And that losing it badly in a territorial court creates a record that follows him. He paused. There are probably other properties he's acquired in other counties, other valleys. A documented finding of material misrepresentation in territorial court is the kind of thing that makes those other situations complicated. She was quiet for a moment, so he settles to contain the damage. That would be my red, and the settlement will give the Pells their water access in writing, and release the restrictive provisions from the Brannan agreement, and probably include something for the legal costs, although that'll be negotiated. He looked at her. It's not everything. The Houghton family, who sold out entirely 3 years ago, they're not getting their land back. That sale was clean and documented, and there's nothing to unwind. They're just gone. Elowen looked at that for a moment. The cost that couldn't be recovered, the part of the damage that was permanent. That was the part people didn't like to sit with, the fact that winning a fight didn't mean undoing everything the fight had caused. The Hootens had moved on because they had to, and a settlement 3 years later didn't put them back on their land. No, she said. They're gone. Yes. She picked up her garden fork and turned another section of soil, which was her way of processing things, keeping her hands in motion while her mind worked. He'd learned to read that about her over the months, the same way he'd learned the particular cadences of the horses and the specific way the West Pasture's drainage behaved in heavy rain. You lived close to something, and you started to know its patterns. Silas, she said without stopping her work. Yes, I need to talk to you about something that isn't the settlement. All right? She stopped, stood up properly, and looked at him with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. I've been thinking about the arrangement. The word arrangement, the same word she'd used in February in the tack room when she'd offered him wages, and a room landed differently now than it had then. It had the weight of everything that had happened since behind it. I want to offer you something different, she said. Something permanent. He waited. He'd learned to wait for Elowen to finish a sentence rather than anticipating it, because her sentences usually went somewhere he hadn't expected. Partnership, she said. Legal partnership. You'd contribute your management, your knowledge, your labor. I'd contribute the land and capital. Over time, with a properly drafted agreement, your contribution earns equity, a real ownership stake that belongs to you. That can be inherited. He looked at her for a long moment. The garden behind her was turned over for winter, the beds bare and clean and ready for what came next. The West Pasture was visible beyond the fence, holding its color even in October, the grass gone dry and golden, but the ground underneath it different from what it had been, no longer dying. Dormant, waiting. I won't accept a charity stake, he said. I know you won't. She said it without impatience. This isn't charity. I've run this property alone and watched it decline for 4 years. You've been here 9 months, and the West Pasture is recovered. The suppliers are contracted. The legal challenges are settled, and the dining room is full 3 nights a week when it used to be full once. She held his gaze. That's not sentiment. That's a documented business case for the partnership I'm proposing. Lydia did a lot of that. Lydia did a remarkable amount of that, Elowen agreed, in the tone that had become her particular way of talking about his daughter, the tone that contained something that was not quite maternal, but was its own sincere thing. She'll be compensated separately and appropriately for as long as she wants to keep her ledger here. She paused. This offer is for you. He thought about his children. He thought about the ranch, the 80 acres his father had built from nothing, that he'd grown up on and worked and lost in a 40-minute proceeding while a judge checked his pocket watch. He thought about what it meant to have something your children could inherit, rather than merely occupy the specific difference between a home built on your own legal stake and a home built on someone else's permission. He thought about Elowen Hartwell, who had handed him a brass key with dignity on the worst night of the last several years, and who had, over the 9 months since, become the person he thought first when something on the property needed a decision, and the person he thought last at night, in the particular way you think about someone when you've stopped pretending you're not. There's something else, he said. That isn't the partnership. She looked at him. I know there is. I haven't said it plainly. No. You've been building up to it for about 3 months, which is honestly faster than I expected, given how you operate. The corner of her mouth, just the corner. Silas. He almost said something careful. Something measured and well-considered, that fully accounted for the complexity of the situation. Then he remembered that he'd been doing that his whole life, and where it had gotten him was standing in a blizzard with 43 cents and 2 cold children. I love you, he said. That's the plain version. She looked at him for a moment. The October garden around them, the turned soil, the bare beds, the West Pasture beyond the fence, the inn behind him with its repaired roof and its full dining room and its ledgers, organized in proper dated columns. I know, she said quietly. I've known for a while. She paused. I love you too. That's also the plain version. He exhaled something he'd been holding for longer than he'd realized. We should probably tell the children, he said. Cal already knows, Elowen said. He told me 2 months ago that he thought I should marry his papa, and that he had several good reasons if I wanted to hear them. Silas stared at her. He's 7. He listed 4 reasons. They were all practical. The third one was that Tuesday would be happier with a proper permanent stall. She looked at him with the expression that had assembled itself from pieces over 9 months, and was now entirely its own thing, affectionate and amused and real, in the way that only things that have been tested are real. He's your son. He didn't have an answer for that. He just stood in the October garden and felt the particular weight of something settling, not the light relief of a burden. Lifted, but the good weight of something that mattered, coming to rest in the right place. Adler's full letter arrived a week later. The settlement terms were, as Silas had predicted, focused on containment. The Pells received their water access restoration in writing, legally binding, and filed with the county, which was what Clara had said from the beginning was the only thing she actually needed. The Brannan use agreement was amended to remove all verbal-only restrictions and formalize the actual terms they'd been told they were signing. Financial restitution for 3 years of unlawful water restriction was calculated at a figure that made Eustace Pell go quiet. When he read it, not a fortune, but enough to repair the dairy operation to the state it should have been in all along. Varick signed the settlement on a Thursday. He did not send a letter. He did not make a statement. He signed through his attorney, and the signed documents were filed at the territorial court the following Monday, and that was the end of it. Now, the territorial judge added one line to the filed settlement that Adler said Varick's lawyers had objected to, and lost a notation that the settlement was reached in the context of documented course of conduct findings, which meant any future proceeding in any county where Varick operated would have access to that record. It wasn't a criminal conviction. It wasn't a public denunciation. It was a quiet line in a filed document that would follow him. Sometimes the most lasting consequences were the quiet ones. Silas and Elowen married in the second week of May, when the cottonwoods along the channel were fully leafed and the west pasture was showing its second year of proper spring growth, thicker than the fruit, more confident, the kind of growth that comes from land that's been given what it needed long enough to stop being surprised by it. The ceremony was not a large one and was not intended to be. Eustace and Clara Pell, the Brannans. Holt, who wore a suit that appeared to be from a decade earlier, and fit him imperfectly, and who stood through the whole thing with the expressions of someone trying not to look affected and failing comfortably. Creddy and Drum. Bess, who cried during the words being exchanged and made no apology for it. Adler had made the trip from Butte because he said professional courtesy required it, which was a formal way of saying he'd come to care about the outcome and wanted to see it. Lydia stood next to her father in a dress that Elowen had helped her make, not a fancy dress, just a proper one, with careful seams and a color that suited her, and she held his hand during the words with a grip that was tighter than her usual. Suppose self would have permitted herself in a more public moment. He held hers back with the same pressure. She didn't cry. She had the expression of someone absorbing something large that she'd been preparing for, and that was still in the act larger than prepared for. Cal wore his good shirt and his good boots, and a serious expression that lasted approximately 4 minutes before he was distracted by a barn cat that had come to investigate the gathering, and who he spent the remainder of the ceremony trying to. Introduced to Drum, who was pretending not to be charmed. They stood beneath the cottonwoods, which was where Silas had proposed holding it because the cottonwoods were the reason any of this was possible. The oldest ones had told him. The channel was there when everything on the surface said the land was dead. He figured that deserved acknowledgement. The words were short and honest. No performance. Elowen said what she meant, and Silas said what he meant, and what they both meant was, I choose this, with full knowledge of what it costs and what it asks and what it gives. That was all you could really say about the significant things. After, standing by the channel with the afternoon sun on the water and the smell of cottonwood leaves coming in on a light wind, Holt appeared next to Silas with 2 cups of whatever Bess had produced for the occasion. Congratulations, Holt said. He said it the way he said everything direct. No particular softening. Thank you, Holt. They stood for a moment. Holt looked at the channel. You know, when you started digging that thing up, he said, I thought you were going to waste a month of labor and a good amount of misses. Hartwell's money on a hole in the ground. I know you did. I didn't say anything, I noticed. Holt drank his cup. I've been managing property for 20 years, he said slowly. I've worked for 4 different owners. I know what I know about land and cattle, and I know it well. He paused. I would have looked at that pasture for another 10 years and called it done. Because that's what everyone said. And everyone had more history with the land than I did, and I trusted the consensus. He looked at Silas. You didn't trust the consensus. I trusted the trees, Silas said. Holt thought about that. Same thing maybe, he said. You trusted what the land was showing you instead of what people had decided about it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a harder thing to do than it sounds. The consensus is loud. It was the most reflective thing Holt had said in Silas Fret's presence in 10 months. It's Brant Sussensen, and he said it without apparent self-consciousness, which was the quality Silas had come to respect most about him. Holt didn't perform insight. When he had something real to say, he just said it. You'll do it too, Silas said. The next time something doesn't match what everyone says, you'll look again. Holt made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he usually got. Maybe, he said. He finished his cup. The cattle, he said, returning to business because he was Holt and couldn't stay away from it long. You still thinking spring acquisition? 20 head on the south section. Another 10 if the upper slope holds through June without supplemental feed. I'd start with 15, Holt said. Conservative first year on recovered pasture. 15, Silas agreed. He wasn't going to argue with Holt on cattle numbers. That was Holt's domain, and Holt knew it. Elowen appeared beside Silas and took the cup from his hand and drank from it, which was such an ordinary and comfortable thing that it registered as its own small grace. She looked at the channel, the water catching the late afternoon light. Clara Pell wants to know if we're interested in expanding the dairy contract in the spring, she said. Their yield projections are better than last year's. How much better? 20%, she says. Could be more if the winter's mild. Tell her yes, Silas said, and ask her what they need from us to make the expansion viable. Elowen looked at him. That last part, what about it? That's the part that matters, she said. Not just agreeing to buy more. Asking what they need to produce more. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas never asked that. He just accepted what was offered and paid what was fair. But he never thought about what the other person needed to do better. He didn't have a response to that. He just stood with it. You do that naturally, she said. Think about what the other person needs to succeed. I've watched you do it with Holt, with the Pells, with the Brannons, with Lydia. She paused. I'm trying to do it more deliberately. You already do it, he said. You handed a penniless man with 2 children the best room in the house. That was different. Was it? She thought about that. Maybe not, she said. The summer that followed was the kind of summer you remember, not because dramatic things happened in it, but because it was full of the right kind of ordinary. The cattle came in May 15 head, Holt's number, well chosen from a rancher in the county east who dealt straight and priced fair. They went to the south section of the west pasture and stayed there, and the pasture held them without complaint, which was the proof that mattered more than any projection. Lydia turned 11 and was formally made a salaried employee of the partnership at a rate Elowen had set and Silas had agreed to, without modification, because Elowen's read of what Lydia's work was worth was accurate, and Silas knew better than to argue with accurate numbers. Lydia accepted the formalization with the dignity of someone who had considered the terms and found them acceptable. Then she asked for a second ledger book, because the first one was nearly full. Cal spent the summer learning everything Holt would teach him, and several things Drum would show him, and some things he worked out on his own through the experimental method that is native to 7-year-olds, mostly carpentry experiments, that produced objects of uncertain purpose but genuine craft. He built a box for Lydia's ledger books that was not perfectly square but was solid and had a latch that worked, and he presented it to her with the gravity of an artisan presenting finished work. She kept her ledger books in it for years. The dining room stayed full. The supplier contracts held. The Pells expanded the dairy contract in the fall when their yields came in ahead of Clara's conservative projection. The Brannon family, with their amended use agreement finally reflecting what they'd been told they were signing, began improving the grain operation they'd deferred for 3 years' new equipment, a storage bar they'd needed since before the Varick agreement, but hadn't been able to build without his approval, under the fraudulent restriction. The Aldridge family on the East Road became a reliable produce supplier, and then 2 other families after them, and by the following spring Northwind House was connected to 7 Valley properties through direct purchasing relationships, a web of mutual economic interest that Varick's isolation strategy had been specifically designed to prevent, and that, now, existed because the thing he'd tried to prevent had made it necessary. The quiet line in the territorial settlement record followed Varick. Silas heard, through Adler's occasional letters and the particular telegraph that moved through ranching communities, that Varick had faced 2 other challenges in neighboring counties in the year following the Red Willow settlement. Different specifics, but the same pattern, and the documented pattern from Red Willow had indeed been introduced as relevant precedent in both cases. Neither case resulted in the same outcome as the Pell and Brannan settlements, but both created enough legal friction that Varick's expansion in those counties stalled. He didn't come back to Red Willow Crossing. Whether that was strategic or personal, Silas didn't know and didn't particularly need to. The finest family room at Northwind House, the one with the iron frame bed and the narrow second bed and the small iron stove, the one where Silas had unlaced Cal's boots with hands that weren't entirely steady, on the worst night of the previous several years, stayed set aside. It wasn't announced. There was no policy posted, no ceremony around it. When travelers arrived at the end of a hard day without enough money for a room, Elowen or whoever was at the counter would assess the situation with the particular quiet competence that Elowen had passed on to the people who worked for her, and if the assessment said what it sometimes said, a brass key was produced and handed across the counter with the same ordinary dignity she'd extended to a penniless cowboy in a blizzard. No pity, no performance. Just the key and the room and the expectation that a person would take what they needed and whatever they could give in return would be enough. Silas knew it happened because he knew the room's occupancy pattern, and because sometimes he saw the travelers at breakfast with the look he recognized the specific expression of someone who'd expected to be turned away and hadn't been, who was still slightly recalibrating their understanding of what the world was going to do to them. He knew that look the way you know something you've worn on your own face. He never talked about it. Elowen never talked about it either, which was part of why they understood each other. There was a morning in the second autumn, Silas' second autumn at Northwind House. The first as its co-owner, when he walked the property before dawn the way he always walked it, checking things, noticing things, the old habit that had never left him. The morning was cold, early October, with frost on the fence posts and the kind of sky that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. He walked the channel. The water moved through it the same way it had moved through it the first morning they'd opened the head gate steady, purposeful, following the grade that someone had engineered a very long time ago. The cottonwoods above it were losing leaves, and the leaves were turning in the current and traveling downstream through the distribution trenches, and the west pasture beyond was gold and dry, but would be green again in May. He thought about what Holt had said at the wedding, about trusting what the land was showing you instead of what people had decided about it. He thought about not as a lesson that had been delivered to him, but as something he'd been practicing his whole lives, without having a name for it. His father had done it too on that first piece of ground. You looked at what was actually there, rather than what the story about the place said was there. Sometimes they matched. Sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, you trusted the thing itself. That was all it was, really. No particular genius. No remarkable strategy. Just the willingness to get down on one knee in a dying pasture and dig until you found out what the ground was actually holding. The frost on the fence posts caught the first light as the sun came up behind the ridge. Silas stood by the channel and watched the valley take shape out of the pre-dawn, dark the Pell property to the northwest, the Brannan Range to the east, the road coming in from the south, where a blizzard had driven him and his children through the door of a place that had no particular reason to let them in. He hadn't planned any of this. He'd planned to get his children warm. Everything else had been one decision, following from the one before it: fix the fence, find the channel, restore the water, stand in the room with the people who were also in the fight, ask what the other person needed to succeed. You made enough of those decisions in sequence, and they added up to something. Not the life you'd planned. The life that was actually there, waiting beneath the surface of the one you thought was gone. The water moved through the channel. The cottonwoods held their last leaves, and in the inn behind him, the finest family room waited with its brass key hanging on the hook for the next person, who came through a storm with less than enough, in need of a wall against the wind and someone willing to hand them a key without making them feel small for needing it. The land survives through people. The peoples survive through each other. That had always been true. It just sometimes took a dying pasture and a man who knew how to listen to trees to make it visible again.